The train lurches forward, iron wheels grinding against frozen rails. And Eliza Whitmore realizes she's been sold like cattle, bound for a ranch at the edge of civilization, where a man she's never met has already signed the papers that make her his property. The contract in her trembling hands isn't a marriage certificate, it's a bill of sale. And in 3 days, she'll stand before witnesses and promise obedience to a man whispered about in back alleys. A rancher whose first wife died trying to give him sons. This isn't a journey west, it's a descent into captivity. Stay with me until the end of this story. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Eliza's journey reaches across the world. The Chicago wind cuts through Eliza's threadbare coat like a knife through cheesecloth as she stood outside the employment office on Clark Street, watching her breath crystallize in the January air. Inside that building, 3 hours earlier, she'd signed away her freedom. The ink was barely dry, and already she could feel the weight of those signatures, hers shaky and reluctant, theirs bold and final, pressing against her chest like a tombstone. 23 years old, and her life had become someone else's merchandise. Miss Whitmore? The clerk's voice drifted through the half-open door. Your train departs in 2 hours. Union Station. You'll want to collect your ticket. Eliza turned slowly, her dark hair whipping across her face. Through the grimy window, she could see the clerk, a thin man with spectacles that magnified his indifferent eyes, holding an envelope. Inside that envelope was a one-way ticket to Montana Territory and a copy of the contract that had transformed her from a person into a transaction. She'd read it 7 times, searching for loopholes that didn't exist. Upon arrival in Silver Ridge, Montana Territory, Miss Eliza Catherine Whitmore shall enter into lawful marriage with Mr. Victor Hale, landowner and cattle rancher, in exchange for the settlement of debts owed by her father, the late Jonathan Whitmore, in the amount of $847, plus accrued interest and associated fees, totaling $1,200. Her father had been dead for 6 weeks. The debts had appeared like vultures within days of his burial. Miss Whitmore? The clerk's impatience sharpened his tone. The ticket? She pushed through the door, and the warmth of the office's coal stove hit her like a mockery. How easily heat could feel like comfort when you'd been cold long enough. How quickly you could mistake relief for rescue. The clerk thrust the envelope toward her. Mr. Hale's agent has been quite generous. First-class accommodation. Meals included. You'll arrive in Silver Ridge in 5 days, weather permitting. And if I don't board that train? The question escaped before Eliza could stop it. A small rebellion, pointless but necessary. The clerk's expression didn't change. He'd heard this before. Then Mr. Hale's representatives will pursue legal remedies for breach of contract. Your father's remaining assets, the furniture, the books, your mother's jewelry, will be seized. You'll be liable for additional penalties. He paused, letting the weight settle. And you'll still have nowhere to go, Miss Whitmore. No references, no employment. Chicago has a way of swallowing people who can't pay their debts. She took the envelope. Her fingers had gone numb. There are worse fates, the clerk continued, his voice softening into something that might have been mistaken for kindness if you didn't look too closely. Mr. Hale is a respected man, wealthy, established. Many women would consider this an opportunity. Many women, Eliza said quietly, haven't been sold. The clerk's sympathy evaporated. You signed the contract voluntarily. That's not selling. That's arrangement. That's survival. He turned back to his desk, shuffling papers that had nothing to do with her. The train leaves at 3 o'clock. Don't miss it. Mr. Hale doesn't tolerate unreliability. Union Station roared with the chaos of departure, steam hissing, whistles screaming, passengers shouting farewells that ranged from tearful to perfunctory. Eliza stood on the platform with her single carpet bag, watching families embrace, watching men in fine suits stride toward private cars, watching children press their faces against windows with the bright excitement of adventure. She felt nothing. No, that wasn't true. She felt everything, but it had all compressed into a dense, suffocating knot just beneath her ribs. Fear, rage, grief, humiliation. They'd fused together into something she couldn't name, something that made it hard to breathe but impossible to cry. First class, miss? A porter appeared at her elbow, eyeing her worn coat and battered bag with barely concealed confusion. First-class passengers usually arrived with trunks and servants. Eliza handed him the ticket. His eyebrows rose. Car 3, miss. Quite comfortable. Mr. Hale's arrangements? She nodded, unable to speak. The porter lifted her bag, so light it barely qualified as luggage, and led her through the crowd. Car 3 gleamed with polished wood and brass fixtures. The seats were upholstered in green velvet. Small lamps with frosted glass shades hung at intervals. It smelled of cigar smoke and expensive perfume. Eliza had never been in a first-class car before. The luxury felt obscene. "Here you are, miss." The porter placed her bag in the overhead rack. "We'll be departing shortly. Dining car is 2 forward. If you need anything, just signal the attendant." He waited. Eliza realized he expected a tip. She had $3.17 to her name, everything left after paying for her father's burial. She fished out a nickel. The porter's expression flickered with disappointment before professional neutrality reasserted itself. "Thank you, miss." She sank into the seat by the window and watched Chicago slide past, first the station, then the factories with their belching smokestacks, then the tenements where she'd spent the last 6 weeks watching her life disintegrate. The city that had devoured her mother to tuberculosis, her father to drink and despair, was now releasing her into something worse. At least in Chicago, she'd been free to starve on her own terms. "Extraordinary weather, isn't it?" The voice came from across the aisle, a woman in her 50s dressed in traveling clothes that suggested wealth without ostentation. "They're saying this is the coldest January in 20 years. Eliza turned. The woman had kind eyes, the sort that made you want to confess everything. Dangerous eyes. "Yes," Eliza managed. "Quite cold." "Traveling far?" "Montana." "Oh, how adventurous. Family there?" The lie formed automatically. "Yes, family." The woman smiled. "How lovely. I'm Mrs. Davison, going as far as Omaha myself. My daughter's just had her 2nd child." "Congratulations." "Thank you, dear." Mrs. Davison settled into her seat with the contentment of someone whose life had unfolded according to plan. "Montana, that's quite a journey." "What part?" "Silver Ridge." Something changed in Mrs. Davison's expression, a flicker of recognition, quickly suppressed. "I see." Eliza's stomach tightened. "You know it?" "Only by reputation." Mrs. Davison busied herself with her handbag, suddenly fascinated by its contents. "Cattle country, very remote." "What else?" The older woman looked up, and Eliza saw pity in those kind eyes. That was worse than the clerk's indifference. Pity meant Mrs. Davison knew something, had heard something, understood something that Eliza was only beginning to suspect. "Nothing, dear. Just that it's quite isolated." "I'm sure you'll find it." She stopped, unable to complete the reassuring lie. "I'm sure you'll manage." The train lurched forward. Eliza felt the city fall away beneath the wheels, felt every mile become a barrier between her and the last place that had known her name, her history, her personhood. Chicago disappeared into the gray winter afternoon, and with it the final possibility of turning back. The first day passed in a blur of frozen landscape and forced conversation. Mrs. Davison meant well, filling the silence with stories about her grandchildren, her garden, her husband's successful law practice. Eliza nodded at appropriate intervals, offered minimum responses, and spent most of her time staring out the window at the endless white expanse of prairie. Night fell. The porter transformed the seats into sleeping berths. Eliza lay in the narrow bed, listening to the rhythmic clatter of wheels on rails, feeling the train carry her farther from everything familiar. Sleep came in fragments, brief unconsciousness interrupted by jolts and the whistle's shriek as they passed through darkened towns. She dreamed of her mother reading by lamplight, her father before the drink took him, a small apartment that had been crowded but hers. She woke gasping, disoriented, the dream dissolving into the reality of green velvet and brass fixtures, and a ticket that could only carry her in one direction. By the second day, Mrs. Davison's cheerful small talk had worn thin. They ate meals in companionable silence in the dining car, Eliza forcing down food she couldn't taste, Mrs. Davison watching her with increasing concern. "My dear," the older woman finally said over dinner, setting down her fork with deliberate care, "I don't mean to pry, but are you quite certain about this journey?" Eliza looked up from the roast chicken she'd been pushing around her plate. "Certain?" "It's just," Mrs. Davison leaned forward, lowering her voice. "You don't have the bearing of a woman going to meet family." You have the bearing of a woman going to meet her executioner. The truth rose in Eliza's throat like bile. She swallowed it back. I'm fine. Because if this is some arrangement you've been pressured into, there are organizations, people who help young women in difficult circumstances. My husband knows several. I signed a contract. The words came out flat, final. Legally binding. Mrs. Davison sat back, understanding flooding her features. Oh, child, one of those. She reached across the table, covering Eliza's hand with her own. The unexpected kindness nearly broke Eliza's composure. A marriage contract? Eliza nodded. May I ask, did you have a choice? The choice was starvation or Montana. I chose Montana. That's not a choice, that's coercion. Mrs. Davison's grip tightened. Listen to me. When we reach Omaha, you can get off this train. My husband has connections. We can find you employment, somewhere to stay while we break a legal contract. Eliza pulled her hand back gently. I read it, Mrs. Davison. Every clause. If I fail to fulfill the terms, the penalties will follow me for the rest of my life. They'll take everything, and they'll make sure I never work again. There are always options, not for women like me, not for women with nothing. Eliza's voice remained steady, but something sharp edged into it. You're kind to offer, but kindness doesn't pay debts. Mrs. Davison's eyes filled with tears. What's his name, this man you're going to? Victor Hale. The older woman's face went pale. She glanced around the dining car, as if the name itself might summon surveillance. When she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. Oh, dear heaven, Victor Hale. Eliza's heart began to hammer. You know him? Not personally, but my husband, he handled a case 3 years ago, a land dispute. Hale's name came up. Mrs. Davison leaned closer. He's powerful, child. Very powerful. Owns half the territory around Silver Ridge, and he's... She paused, choosing words carefully. He's not known for his kindness to women. His first wife, Eliza said. She died. That's what they say. Died in childbirth, according to the official record. Mrs. Davison's expression darkened. But there were rumors, terrible rumors, that she was encouraged to keep trying for heirs, that the pressure... She stopped, unable to continue. The dining car suddenly felt too warm, too close. Eliza could feel the walls contracting, the air thinning. Encouraged? It doesn't matter if she wanted to stop, if her body couldn't take another pregnancy, if the doctors warned against it. Mrs. Davison's voice had gone hard. What mattered was giving Victor Hale a son. Eliza stood abruptly. Excuse me. She fled the dining car, pushing through to the platform between cars. The cold night air hit her like a slap. The train was crossing a river bridge, and she could see dark water far below, rushing past in the moonlight. For one wild moment, she imagined jumping, the fall, the shock of cold water, the blessed release from this nightmare. But she didn't jump. Because that would be giving Victor Hale exactly what he'd paid for, a woman with no options and no future. The door opened behind her. Mrs. Davison stood there, her shawl wrapped tight against the wind. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said anything. You should have said it sooner, before I signed. Would it have changed anything? Eliza laughed, a bitter, broken sound. No, it wouldn't have. They stood together in the cold and the noise, watching the landscape rush past in shadows and moonlight. Finally, Mrs. Davison spoke again. There's something else you should know. She had to raise her voice over the wind and the wheels. About the contract you signed. What about it? Those contracts. Marriage contracts entered under financial duress. They're being challenged in courts. Not successfully yet, but the legal ground is shifting. If you could get to a city, find a lawyer willing to take the case. Mrs. Davison. Eliza turned to face her. I have $3. I'll be in the middle of Montana territory, hundreds of miles from the nearest real city. Victor Hale owns the town, the sheriff, probably the judge. Who's going to challenge him? Who's going to risk their livelihood for a woman with a contract in her name? The older woman had no answer. They returned to their seats. Mrs. Davison fell into troubled silence. Eliza stared out the window and tried to imagine what Victor Hale looked like. The contract had included no photograph, no description beyond landowner and cattle rancher. She pictured a hard man, weathered by frontier life. Old, probably. Why else would he need to buy a wife? She wondered if he would be cruel from the beginning, or if the cruelty would reveal itself slowly, like rot spreading through wood. Omaha came on the third morning. Mrs. Davison gathered her belongings, but before disembarking, she pressed something into Eliza's hand. My address in Omaha. And $50. She closed Eliza's fingers around the bills before she could protest. Don't argue. If you need help, if you can find a way to leave, write to me. My husband's name carries weight. We'll do what we can. Eliza's throat tightened. Why would you help me? You don't even know me. Because I have daughters. Because I can imagine them in your place. Mrs. Davison's voice broke. Because someone should have helped you before it came to this. They embraced briefly. Eliza, who had been untouched by kindness for so long, nearly collapsed into the older woman's arms. But then Mrs. Davison was gone, stepping onto the platform and disappearing into the crowd, taking with her the last connection to a world where people helped each other without contracts or payment. Eliza tucked the money and address into her bag. $50 wouldn't buy her freedom, but it was more than she'd had. It was something. A small light in the encroaching darkness. The train rolled on. Wyoming passed in endless stretches of empty land. The passengers thinned at each stop. By the fourth day, Eliza had the compartment to herself. The silence was both relief and threat. Relief because she no longer had to maintain the pretense of composure. Threat because there was nothing to distract her from the countdown. One more day. Then Silver Ridge. Then Victor Hale. Then marriage. The final signature. The final trap. She spent the fourth night sleepless, watching the stars through the window. Her mother had loved the stars, had taught Eliza their names and patterns. Cassiopeia. Orion. The North Star, constant and reliable. Her mother had said the stars were proof that some things remained fixed even when the world fell apart. But her mother had been wrong. Nothing remained fixed, nothing lasted. People died, debts appeared, and suddenly you were property bound for a ranch at the edge of nowhere, where a man waited who saw you as livestock to be bred and broken. Dawn broke over Montana territory. The landscape had changed overnight, mountains rising in purple shadows, forests of pine replacing the prairie, the air growing thinner and colder. This was the frontier, the edge of civilization, where the normal rules bent until they broke. The train slowed. A sign flashed past. Silver Ridge, 5 miles. Eliza's hands began to shake. She pressed them against her skirt, trying to still them through force of will. It didn't work. Her whole body had begun to tremble. Small, violent tremors that started deep and radiated outward. This was terror, pure, undiluted terror. The train pulled into Silver Ridge Station just after noon. Eliza gathered her carpet bag, her coat, the tattered remnants of her dignity. When she stepped onto the platform, the cold hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't Chicago cold. This was something else, something that cut through flesh and found bone. Silver Ridge was smaller than she'd expected. One main street lined with wooden buildings, a hotel, a general store, a saloon with swinging doors. People moved with purpose, bundled against the cold, barely glancing at the train or its passengers. Miss Whitmore? She turned. A man stood behind her, tall, thin, dressed in a long coat and flat-brimmed hat. His face was weathered, but not unkind. He looked like he'd spent his life outdoors. Yes? She managed. I'm Thomas Fletcher, mister. Hale's foreman. I'll be taking you to the ranch. He reached for her bag. Is this everything? Yes. Fletcher's eyebrows rose slightly. Surprise or pity? She couldn't tell. But he didn't comment. The wagon's this way. He led her through the small town to a covered wagon hitched to 2 sturdy horses. The wagon bed was lined with hay and blankets, clearly prepared for a long, cold journey. Fletcher helped her up, then climbed into the driver's seat. How far is the ranch? Eliza asked. 23 miles. We'll be there by dark. He clicked to the horses, and they started forward, leaving Silver Ridge behind. The first few miles passed in silence. The road, barely more than twin ruts in the frozen ground, wound through pine forest and across frozen streams. The mountains loomed closer, their peaks sharp against the pale sky. Finally, Fletcher spoke. "You ever been out west before, Miss Whitmore?" "No." "It's different here, harsher, takes some getting used to." "I imagine it does." More silence. Then, "Mr. Hale's a good employer, fair, pays on time, expects hard work, but he provides for his people." Eliza heard what Fletcher wasn't saying. "He's good to his employees." "I didn't say anything about wives." "What should I expect?" she asked quietly. Fletcher kept his eyes on the road. "The ranch is large, 3,000 acres. Main house, bunkhouse for the hands, barns, outbuildings. About 20 men work there full-time. Mrs. Shaw runs the household. She's the housekeeper. Been with Mr. Hale for years. She'll show you how things work." "That's not what I meant." Fletcher's jaw tightened. "I know what you meant, miss, but it's not my place to say." "Please," Eliza leaned forward. "I need to know what I'm walking into." He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Mr. Hale is particular. He has expectations, rules. The house runs a certain way, and he doesn't tolerate deviation." Fletcher glanced at her briefly. "His first wife, Margaret, she had a hard time adjusting, came from back east like you. Found the isolation difficult. I heard she died in childbirth. 4th try." Fletcher's voice had gone flat. "Doctor told both of them, that she shouldn't attempt another pregnancy. Her body couldn't handle it. But Mr. Hale wanted sons, and she died trying to give them to him." "She died giving him what he demanded." Fletcher's hands tightened on the reins. "I shouldn't be telling you this, but you seem like a decent person, Miss Whitmore, and I figure you have a right to know what you're facing." Eliza's terror crystallized into something clearer, sharper. "Why doesn't anyone stop him?" "Stop him from what? Everything he did was legal. A man has rights over his wife. That's the law." Fletcher's voice carried years of bitter resignation. "And out here, Mr. Hale is the law. He owns the land, employs half the territory, has connections in every county office. Who's going to challenge him?" The same question Mrs. Davison couldn't answer. The same question that had no answer. They rode on. The sun arced across the sky, shadows lengthening. The temperature dropped steadily. Eliza pulled her coat tighter, but the cold came from inside now. A deep, bone-level chill that no amount of wool could touch. As twilight approached, Fletcher pointed ahead. "There, that's Hale Ranch." Eliza looked. The ranch sprawled across a valley, backed by mountains. The main house was large, 2 stories, painted white, with a wide porch and tall windows that glowed with lamplight. Barns and outbuildings clustered nearby. Fences stretched in every direction, dividing the land into pastures and corrals. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, gray against the darkening sky. It looked prosperous, established, permanent. It looked like a prison built from timber and ambition. Fletcher drove the wagon up to the main house and stopped. Before he could help Eliza down, the front door opened. A woman emerged, older, perhaps 60, with iron-gray hair pulled back severely. She wore a plain black dress and an expression that gave nothing away. "Mrs. Shaw," Fletcher said, "this is Miss Whitmore." The housekeeper's gaze traveled over Eliza. Quick, assessing, final. "So you're the new one. Not welcome. Not pleased to meet you. Just, so you're the new one." "Yes," Eliza said, climbing down from the wagon. Her legs nearly buckled after hours of sitting, but she forced herself to stand straight. "Mr. Hale is in his study. He'll want to see you immediately." Mrs. Shaw's tone suggested this was not optional. "Follow me." Fletcher touched his hat brim, an apologetic gesture, and drove the wagon toward the barns, leaving Eliza's bag on the porch. Eliza followed Mrs. Shaw inside. The house was as impressive as its exterior promised. Polished wood floors, heavy furniture, oil paintings of landscapes and cattle. A staircase rising to the 2nd floor. Everything spoke of wealth, taste, permanence. Everything was designed to impress, to intimidate, to remind visitors of Victor Hale's power. Mrs. Shaw led her down a hallway to a closed door. She knocked twice. "Enter." The voice from inside was deep, authoritative, used to being obeyed. Mrs. Shaw opened the door. "Miss Whitmore, sir." "Thank you, Mrs. Shaw. That will be all." The housekeeper withdrew, closing the door behind her with a soft click that sounded like a cell door locking. Eliza stood just inside the study, facing the man who had purchased her future. Victor Hale sat behind a massive desk, papers spread before him. He was older than she'd imagined, 50, perhaps, with silver threading through dark hair, a face lined by weather and command. He wore expensive clothes, tailored vest, white shirt, dark trousers, and exuded the confidence of a man who had built something substantial from nothing and intended to keep it. He studied her with the same assessing gaze Mrs. Shaw had used, but his evaluation went deeper, more invasive. Eliza felt exposed, examined, judged, livestock being inspected before sale. Finally, he spoke. "You're younger than I expected. I'm 23. You look 18. He stood coming around the desk, tall, broad-shouldered, physically imposing. "But that's not necessarily a disadvantage. You're healthy?" The question was so clinical, so devoid of any pretense of courtesy, that Eliza could only nod. "Good. The journey wasn't too difficult?" "It was long. You'll get used to the isolation. Most people do, eventually." Hale moved to the window, looking out at his domain. "I assume you've read the contract thoroughly. Do you understand the terms?" "Yes." "Then let me be clear about expectations." He turned to face her, and his eyes were hard. Not cruel exactly, but absolutely inflexible. "This ranch is my life's work. Everything here exists because I built it, maintained it, protected it. I need a wife who understands that the ranch comes first. Always." "I understand." "Do you?" He stepped closer. "I don't need companionship, Miss Whitmore. I don't need affection or romance. What I need is a woman capable of running this household, representing me socially when necessary, and providing me with heirs." There it was. The truth, naked and ugly. She was livestock, breeding stock. "The wedding will take place in 3 days," Hale continued. "The circuit judge will be here. Afterward, you'll assume your duties as mistress of this house." He paused, watching her face for reaction. "Mrs. Shaw will instruct you on how things are done here. You'll follow her guidance and my rules precisely. Is that clear?" "Yes." "I don't tolerate disobedience, Miss Whitmore. I don't tolerate failures. My first wife—" He stopped, something flickering in his expression. "My first wife had difficulty adapting to life here. I expect you'll prove more resilient." Resilient. As if Margaret Hale's death had been a failure of character rather than the inevitable result of his demands. "Do you have any questions?" Hale asked. 1,000 questions screamed in Eliza's mind, but only one mattered. "Where will I sleep until the wedding?" "Mrs. Shaw will show you to the guest room. You'll take your meals with me, but otherwise you'll keep to the house. I don't want you wandering the property unsupervised. The ranch can be dangerous for those unfamiliar with it." Dangerous? Like the first wife who died trying to please him. "That's all," Hale said, returning to his desk. "You may go." Dismissed. Like a servant. Like property. Eliza turned and walked out, her legs somehow still supporting her. In the hallway, Mrs. Shaw waited, impassive as stone. "I'll show you to your room," the housekeeper said, starting up the stairs. The guest room was at the end of the second-floor hallway, a small space with a bed, a dresser, a single window overlooking the yard. Simple but clean. The room of someone temporary, someone who would soon move to more permanent quarters. Mrs. Shaw set Eliza's bag on the bed. "Dinner is at 6. Dress appropriately. Mr. Hale expects punctuality." She turned to leave, then paused in the doorway. "One piece of advice, Miss Whitmore." "Yes?" The housekeeper's expression remained neutral, but something shifted in her eyes, a flicker of warning, maybe even sympathy. "Don't make the same mistakes Margaret made. Don't argue. Don't cry. Don't hope for anything beyond what's written in that contract. And if I do? Then you'll end up like her, Mrs. Shaw's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "Buried in the family plot, with a tombstone that calls it tragic but inevitable." She left, closing the door softly. Eliza sat on the bed, alone for the first time in days. The room was quiet except for the wind rattling the window. Through the glass, she could see the mountains in the distance, their peaks sharp against the night sky. 3 days until the wedding. 3 days until the trap closed completely. She pulled Mrs. Davison's address from her bag and stared at it. $50 and an address in Omaha. It was something. But it was 900 miles away, and she was here, surrounded by Victor Hale's land, his power, his absolute control. Eliza stood and walked to the window. Below, she could see the yard, the barns, the distant glow of the bunkhouse. Men moved through the lamplight, Hale's employees, witnesses to whatever came next. Fletcher had said the ranch was dangerous for those unfamiliar with it, but Eliza was beginning to realize the real danger wasn't the land or the isolation. It was the man who owned both. And in 3 days, he would own her too. She pressed her hand against the cold glass and tried to imagine a way out. But the darkness outside offered no answers, no escape routes, no hope. Only mountains and distance and the vast, indifferent silence of the frontier. Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed 6 times. Dinner. Time to go downstairs and sit across from Victor Hale and pretend this was something other than what it was. Time to begin learning the rules of her captivity. Eliza straightened her dress, smoothed her hair, and opened the door. The hallway stretched before her, long, shadowed, leading down to the life she'd been sold into. She took a breath and started walking. Dinner was a performance of civility stretched over a foundation of absolute control. The dining room gleamed with polished silver and crystal, candles flickering in elaborate holders, throwing shadows that danced across the papered walls. A fire crackled in the hearth, but its warmth couldn't touch the cold that had settled in Eliza's chest. Victor Hale sat at the head of the table, she at the other end, the distance between them filled with expensive china and in silence that felt deliberately constructed. Mrs. Shaw served the meal, roasted beef, potatoes, vegetables from a root cellar, moving with the efficiency of someone who had performed these motions for years. "The meal is satisfactory?" Hale asked, cutting his meat with precise movements. "Yes, thank you." Eliza's voice sounded hollow in the formal space. "Mrs. Shaw is an excellent cook. You'll find the household runs smoothly under her direction." He took a bite, chewed, swallowed. "Tomorrow, she'll review your duties with you. The keys to the pantry, the linen closets, the accounts. You'll need to familiarize yourself with inventory management." Eliza nodded, pushing food around her plate. Her appetite had vanished the moment she'd entered this house. "I expect the household to maintain certain standards," Hale continued, as if discussing a business arrangement rather than a marriage. "Meals served punctually. The house kept clean. Social obligations met when required. Silver Ridge may be small, but there are ranchers' wives who gather monthly. You'll be expected to attend to represent this household appropriately." "I understand." His gaze sharpened. "Do you?" Because Margaret found these expectations burdensome. She complained about the isolation, the work, the lack of refinement, she called it, as if civilization ended at Chicago's borders. The name hung in the air between them. Margaret, the ghost who haunted this house, the woman who'd died trying to meet impossible demands. "I'm not Margaret," Eliza said quietly. "No, you're younger, healthier, I hope. And you've come from worse circumstances, which should make you more grateful." He set down his fork, studying her with that clinical assessment. "Tell me, Miss Whitmore, what did you do in Chicago before your father's death?" "I worked in a textile factory. Before that, I helped care for my mother during her illness." "So you're accustomed to hard work?" "Yes." "Good. That will serve you well here." Hale returned to his meal, apparently satisfied. "The ranch requires constant attention. We're building something that will last generations. That's why heirs are essential. A legacy means nothing without someone to inherit it." There it was again. The true purpose of this arrangement, stated with the casual certainty of someone who'd never questioned his right to demand it. "My first wife was delicate," he continued, almost to himself. "City-bred, unused to physical demands. Each pregnancy weakened her, but she understood the importance of perseverance." His expression darkened. "The doctor was overly cautious. Doctors always are. They focus on individual frailty rather than seeing the larger purpose." Eliza's hands clenched beneath the table. "She died. She died fulfilling her duty. There's honor in that." Hale's voice carried no grief, only the cool satisfaction of someone who'd extracted maximum value from an investment. "I trust you'll prove more resilient." The meal continued in oppressive silence. When Mrs. Shaw finally cleared the plates, Eliza felt like she'd been holding her breath for an hour. "You may retire," Hale said, standing. "I have work to attend to. Tomorrow, Mrs. Shaw will begin your instruction. The day after, the dressmaker from Silver Ridge will arrive to fit your wedding dress. The ceremony is scheduled for Saturday afternoon. 3 days, 72 hours until she stood before a judge and spoke vows that would seal her into this cage permanently. Good night, Miss Whitmore." "Good night." Eliza fled to her room, closing the door and leaning against it as if Victor Hale might follow. But he wouldn't. He didn't need to. She was already trapped, already owned by the contract that had brought her here. She changed into her nightgown and lay in the unfamiliar bed, staring at the ceiling. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked. Outside, wind moaned through the eaves. The mountains pressed close in the darkness, and Eliza felt their weight, ancient, indifferent, watching her small human drama with geological patience. Sleep came eventually, but it brought dreams of Chicago, of her mother's grave, of a contract written in ink that turned to blood as she watched. Morning arrived with pale winter light and a knock on her door. Mrs. Shaw entered without waiting for permission, carrying a tray with breakfast: eggs, toast, coffee. "Eat quickly," the housekeeper said, setting the tray on the dresser. "We have a great deal to cover today, and Mr. Hale expects you to be ready to assume your duties immediately after the wedding." Eliza forced down the food while Mrs. Shaw stood by the window, gazing out at the ranch with an expression that might have been weariness or resignation or both. "How long have you worked here?" Eliza asked. 15 years. I came when Mr. Hale first built the house, watched him transform raw land into what you see now." Mrs. Shaw's tone was neutral, giving nothing away. "He's exacting, but fair to those who follow instructions." "And his first wife? Was he fair to her?" The housekeeper's jaw tightened. "That's not a question I'll answer. Please, I need to know what happened to her." Mrs. Shaw turned, and for a moment, genuine emotion flickered across her weathered face. "What happened to Margaret Hale was what happens to any woman who marries a man like Victor Hale. She learned that love doesn't matter, that her wishes don't matter, that her very life matters less than his ambition." Her voice dropped. "And she learned it too late to save herself." "But you stayed. Why?" "Because I'm staff, not wife. I have a role, boundaries, a salary. I can leave if I choose." Mrs. Shaw's expression hardened again. "You signed a contract. You can't." The truth of it settled like stones in Eliza's stomach. "Finish your breakfast," Mrs. Shaw said, her professional mask sliding back into place. "Then I'll show you the house." The tour consumed the morning. Mrs. Shaw led Eliza through every room, explaining the routines that kept the household functioning. The kitchen, where breakfast was prepared at 5:30, lunch at noon, dinner at 6, with military precision. The pantry, with its shelves of preserved foods, its ledger tracking every item used and needed. The linen closets, the cleaning supplies, the china stored in glass-fronted cabinets. "Mr. Hale expects inventory reports monthly," Mrs. Shaw explained, showing Eliza a leather-bound ledger. "Every expense must be justified. He reviews the accounts personally. What if something is needed that's not in the budget? Then you request approval first. Never exceed the budget without permission." The housekeeper's tone suggested this wasn't advice, but commandment. They moved through the formal rooms, the parlor where Margaret Hale's portrait hung above the mantel, a young woman with sad eyes and a forced smile. The library with its books arranged by subject and size. The music room with a piano that looked untouched. "Does Mr. Hale play?" Eliza asked. "No, Margaret did, or tried to. She wasn't very accomplished." Mrs. Shaw straightened a chair that was already perfectly positioned. "Mr. Hale doesn't value frivolous pursuits. If you have hobbies, keep them private and ensure they don't interfere with your duties." The upstairs held bedrooms, guest rooms, currently empty, that would theoretically host visitors who never came. And at the end of the hall, double doors leading to what Mrs. Shaw called the master suite. "Your quarters after the wedding," the housekeeper said, not opening the doors. "Mr. Hale's bedroom and the adjoining wife's room. Margaret's things have been removed, but the furniture remains. You'll have privacy when he chooses to grant it, and access to his room when he requires it." The clinical description made Eliza's skin crawl. This wasn't a marriage. It was an arrangement of rooms and schedules and required access. Mrs.
Shaw, Eliza said carefully, you warned me not to make Margaret's mistakes. What were they? The housekeeper paused, considering. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of witnessing. She argued. When Mr. Hale gave orders, she questioned them, tried to negotiate, to insert her own preferences. He doesn't tolerate that. He sees it as insubordination, as challenge to his authority. She turned to face Eliza directly. She also cried, constantly.
The isolation broke her spirit, and she let it show. Mr. Hale interprets tears as weakness, as manipulation. He has no patience for either. And the pregnancies? She wanted to stop. After the second loss, she begged him. After the third, she pleaded with the doctor to intervene, to tell Mr. Hale it was too dangerous to continue. Mrs. Shaw's expression darkened. But Mr. Hale dismissed the doctor's concerns as excessive caution, and Margaret was too weak, too broken by then to refuse him. She couldn't refuse her own husband? Could you? Mrs. Shaw's question cut like a blade. You're going to stand before a judge and promise obedience. What do you think that means in practical terms? It means what he wants supersedes what you want. What he demands, you provide. That's the law. That's marriage. The housekeeper's pragmatic cruelty was almost worse than Hale's. At least his demands were transparent. Mrs. Shaw offered the truth wrapped in the assumption that Eliza would accept it, would adapt, would become whatever was required to survive. Maybe she was right. They returned to the kitchen, where Mrs. Shaw reviewed the evening routine: dinner preparation, table setting, cleanup. The work itself wasn't difficult. Eliza had managed households before, had stretched pennies into meals during her mother's illness. But the rigidity, the constant surveillance, the assumption that any deviation would bring consequences, that was new. One more thing, Mrs. Shaw said as the morning stretched toward noon. The hands who work this ranch, they're good men mostly, but they're loyal to Mr. Hale. They depend on him for their livelihoods. If you are thinking of seeking assistance from any of them, don't. They won't risk their positions for you. What about Fletcher? He seemed... Thomas Fletcher is Mr. Hale's right hand. He's been here 12 years. Yes, he was kind to you during the drive from Silver Ridge. But don't mistake kindness for alliance. When it comes to choosing between you and his job, he'll choose his job every time. Eliza nodded slowly, understanding the lesson. She was alone here, completely alone, surrounded by people who would watch her struggle and do nothing. I'll leave you to rest before lunch, Mrs. Shaw said. Tomorrow, the dressmaker arrives. After that, there's little time before the wedding. Use these days to prepare yourself mentally. Once you're married, there's no going back. No divorce, no escape clauses. You'll be Mrs. Victor Hale until one of you dies. The housekeeper departed, leaving Eliza in the kitchen with the weight of that truth pressing down like a physical force. Until one of you dies. Margaret had died first. How convenient for Victor Hale. Bartsit. The afternoon stretched empty and oppressive. Eliza returned to her room, unable to stomach lunch, and sat by the window watching the ranch operations. Men moved through the cold, tending horses, repairing fences, hauling feed. From this distance, they looked like pieces on a game board, arranged, directed, controlled by the man who owned the land beneath their feet. She pulled out Mrs. Davison's address and the $50. The money felt like both lifeline and mockery. What could $50 do? Buy a train ticket back to Chicago, where she had nothing and no one? Pay for a hotel room while she looked for work that wouldn't exist because Hale's lawyers would blacklist her for breach of contract? The contract. Always the contract, binding her more surely than any chain. Eliza stood and paced the small room. 3 steps to the window. Turn. 3 steps to the door. Turn. The cage's dimensions already memorized. A knock interrupted her restless movement. She opened the door to find Fletcher standing in the hallway, hat in hand, looking uncomfortable. Miss Whitmore, sorry to disturb you. Mr. Hale asked me to check if you needed anything from Silver Ridge. I'm heading into town for supplies. No, thank you. Fletcher nodded but didn't leave. He shifted his weight, clearly wrestling with something, finally. How are you settling in? The concern in his voice nearly undid her composure. As well as can be expected. Mrs. Shaw giving you the full education? She's been Thorough. She would be. Fletcher glanced down the hall, ensuring they were alone. Listen, Miss Whitmore, I know this isn't what you chose. I know you're scared. But if you can just adapt, keep your head down, do what's expected, it gets easier. Not good maybe, but easier. Is that what you told Margaret? The foreman's face hardened. I told Margaret the same thing. She didn't listen. She fought him, pushed back, tried to change things that can't be changed. And it destroyed her. His voice dropped. I'm not saying it's right. I'm saying it's reality. And in this reality, Victor Hale wins. He always wins. Why? Eliza stepped closer, urgency sharpening her tone. Why does he always win? He's just one man. One man who controls thousands of acres, employs dozens of workers, has relationships with every official in the county. One man who understands power and how to use it. Fletcher met her eyes. You can't beat him, Miss Whitmore, but you can survive him. That's the best outcome available. He left before she could respond, his boots heavy on the stairs. Eliza closed the door and leaned against it, trembling. Everyone kept offering the same advice: adapt, submit, survive. As if survival without freedom was worth having. As if becoming a shadow of herself was an acceptable price for breathing. But what choice did she have? The question haunted her through the rest of the day. She took dinner alone in her room, unable to face another performance across the table from Victor Hale. Mrs. Shaw brought the tray without comment, perhaps understanding that even pretense had its limits. Night fell. The house grew quiet. Eliza lay in bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds: wind in the eaves, the distant call of some animal, the creak of old timber settling. She thought about Chicago, about the small apartment where she'd been poor but free, about her mother reading by candlelight because they couldn't afford lamp oil. Her mother had told her once that dignity wasn't something others could take. You had to give it away. Eliza was beginning to understand she'd signed away her dignity along with her freedom, traded it for survival in a contract that treated both as commodities. Sleep came late and brought no rest. The second day began like the first. Breakfast delivered by Mrs. Shaw, instructions given with cold efficiency. But today, something was different. The housekeeper's movements were sharper, her tone more clipped. The dressmaker will arrive at 10, Mrs. Shaw said. Mr. Hale has selected the design. Your job is to stand still and let her work. He selected my wedding dress? He selects everything, Miss Whitmore. The sooner you understand that, the better. The housekeeper paused at the door. And we'll have a visitor this afternoon, Mrs. Catherine Brennan, wife of the neighboring rancher. She's come to, assess you. Assess me? To determine if you're suitable, if you'll uphold the standards expected of a rancher's wife. Mrs. Shaw's expression was unreadable. Be polite. Be demure. Don't offer opinions unless asked, and keep them bland when you do. Mrs. Brennan reports back to the other wives, and you'll need their acceptance if you're to have any social life here. Social life. The concept seemed absurd in this context, but Eliza nodded, adding another role to the growing list: wife, housekeeper, inventory manager, and now performer for the local women who would judge her worthiness. The dressmaker arrived precisely at 10, a thin woman named Mrs. Pierce, all sharp angles and measuring tapes. She brought fabric samples and pattern books, though these seemed for show, since Victor Hale had already made his selections. Mr. Hale wants something traditional, Mrs. Pierce said, unpacking her materials in the parlor. White silk, high collar, long sleeves, modest but elegant. A dress that makes a statement about propriety and permanence. Eliza stood while Mrs. Pierce measured waist, bust, hips, arms, shoulders. The dressmaker worked with brisk efficiency, calling out numbers that Mrs. Shaw recorded in a small notebook. You're very slim, Mrs. Pierce observed. The dress will need to be fitted carefully. We want it to look substantial, not fragile. Why substantial? The dressmaker glanced at Mrs. Shaw, who gave a minute shake of her head. Just the style Mr. Hale prefers, dear. Nothing to worry about. But Eliza understood. Substantial meant healthy, capable of bearing children. The dress, like everything else, was a statement of her purchased purpose. The fitting lasted 2 hours. Mrs. Pierce pinned and adjusted, draped fabric over Eliza's shoulders, discussed hem lengths and button placements with Mrs. Shaw, as if Eliza were a mannequin rather than a person. Finally, satisfied, the dressmaker packed her materials. "I'll have it ready by Friday evening," she said. "The veil is already prepared. It belonged to the first Mrs. Hale. Mr. Hale wants you to wear it." Of course he did. Margaret's veil, worn by the replacement wife. Another reminder that Eliza was just the latest occupant of a role, interchangeable and temporary. After the dressmaker departed, Mrs. Shaw ordered Eliza to change into her best dress, which wasn't saying much, in preparation for Mrs. Brennan's visit. "Remember," the housekeeper said as Eliza descended the stairs at 2:00, "polite, demure, bland. Don't give her anything to criticize." Mrs. Catherine Brennan arrived in a fine carriage, dressed in wool and fur, her face sharp with intelligence and judgment. She was perhaps 40, with the weathered beauty of someone who'd spent years on the frontier but retained the bearing of her better origins. Mrs. Shaw served tea in the parlor, while Mrs. Brennan studied Eliza with the thoroughness of someone evaluating livestock. "So you're the new Mrs. Hale," she said, sipping her tea with delicate precision. "From Chicago, I understand." "Yes, ma'am." "And your family? What was your father's profession?" The question was a trap. Admitting her father had died in debt, that she'd worked in a factory, would mark her as inferior, but lying would be discovered eventually. "My father was a clerk," Eliza said carefully. "He passed recently." "I'm sorry for your loss." Mrs. Brennan's sympathy was performative. "And you came west to start fresh. How enterprising." "I came west because Mr. Hale offered an opportunity." "Indeed. Victor is quite strategic in his opportunities." Mrs. Brennan set down her cup. "You know, of course, about Margaret." "I know she died." "Such a tragedy. She was delicate, poor thing, city-bred, unused to our harsh climate and demands." The older woman's gaze sharpened. "I hope you're made of sturdier material." "I've survived hardship before." "Different hardships, I suspect. Poverty is one thing. Isolation is another." Mrs. Brennan leaned forward slightly. "Out here, a woman needs resilience. The ranchers' wives, we form a sort of community. We visit monthly, share news, support each other through the difficult times. But we also maintain standards. We expect our members to uphold certain decorum." "I understand." "Do you?" Because Margaret struggled with that. She complained about the isolation, about Victor's expectations, about the life she'd agreed to. Complaints undermine the social fabric. They suggest dissatisfaction, which breeds discontent in other wives. Mrs. Brennan's tone hardened. "We can't allow that." Eliza felt anger flare but suppressed it. This woman was telling her to suffer silently, to accept whatever came without protest, to participate in her own oppression for the sake of social fabric. "I don't intend to complain," she said quietly. "Good. Then we'll welcome you into our circle." Mrs. Brennan stood, smoothing her skirts. "The wedding is Saturday, yes?" "I'll attend, of course. Victor's weddings are always notable events." Victor's weddings. Plural. As if he were a man who cycled through wives like livestock. After Mrs. Brennan departed, Eliza sat in the parlor, staring at Margaret's portrait. The young woman looked back with eyes that seemed to hold a warning. This is what becomes of us. This is how we disappear. "You handled that well," Mrs. Shaw said, entering with the tea service. "Mrs. Brennan will give a favorable report." "Does her opinion matter?" "It matters if you want any connection to other women out here. The ranchers' wives control the social sphere. Cross them, and you'll be completely isolated." The housekeeper paused. "More isolated than you already are, I should say." Eliza looked up. "Mrs. Shaw, why do you stay here? You could work anywhere. Why remain in a house where you watched a woman die from her husband's demands?" The housekeeper's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something raw beneath. "Because I'm 63 years old. Because I have no family, no other prospects. Because Victor Hale pays well and on time, and that matters more than morality when you're trying to survive to old age." She met Eliza's gaze. "We all make compromises, Miss Whitmore. Mine is staying. Yours is marrying. Don't judge me until you've lived long enough to understand the choices narrow as you age." She left with the tea service, and Eliza was alone again with Margaret's portrait and the growing understanding that everyone in this house, everyone on this ranch, had made their peace with Victor Hale's cruelty because fighting it cost more than they could afford. That evening, Hale summoned her to his study after dinner. Eliza entered to find him at his desk, papers spread before him, a glass of whiskey at his elbow. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a chair across from him. She sat, hands folded in her lap, posture straight, performing the role of obedient wife-to-be. "Mrs. Brennan's report was favorable," Hale said. "She found you acceptable. That's good. You'll need the rancher's wife's approval if you're to function socially here. I'm glad I met her expectations." "Don't be glib, Miss Whitmore. I'm stating facts." He set down his pen, regarding her with that cold assessment. "Tomorrow is your last day before the wedding. Use it to prepare yourself mentally for what comes after." "And what comes after?" "Your duties as my wife, managing the household, representing me at social functions, and providing me with heirs." He said it without inflection, as if discussing crop rotation. "The last is particularly important. I'm 52 years old. I don't have unlimited time to build a family." "And if I can't?" The question escaped before Eliza could stop it. Hale's expression darkened. "Can't or won't?" "Can't. If my body, like Margaret's body was weak because she made it weak. Excessive worry, constant tears, failure to maintain proper health." He leaned back in his chair. "You're young, healthy. There's no reason you should encounter the same difficulties. Unless the difficulties came from too much pressure, too many demands." Silence fell between them, dangerous and sharp. Hale's eyes narrowed. "Are you questioning my judgment, Miss Whitmore?" "I'm asking what happens if I can't meet your expectations." "Then you'll keep trying until you do, or until you can't try anymore." His voice was flat, final. "That's the contract. That's the commitment. I didn't purchase your services to accept failure." Purchase. He'd said it outright. The pretense of marriage dropped, revealing the transaction beneath. "Now," Hale continued, "is there anything else you wish to discuss before Saturday?" Eliza thought of 100 questions. What if I run? What if I refuse? What if I fight back? But she already knew the answers. The contract, the law, the isolation, the power imbalance so severe it made resistance seem like a child's fantasy. "No," she said quietly. "Nothing else." "Then you may go. I'll see you at dinner tomorrow. After that, the rehearsal with the judge. Then Saturday, the ceremony." He returned to his papers, dismissing her without another glance. Eliza walked back to her room on legs that felt disconnected from her body. She passed Mrs. Shaw in the hallway, past the closed doors of empty guest rooms, past Margaret's portrait with its sad, knowing eyes. In her room, she sat at the small desk and pulled out paper and pen. Her hand shook as she wrote, "Mrs. Davison, I'm writing to let you know I arrived safely in Silver Ridge. The ranch is remote but substantial. Mr. Hale is exactly what you feared. The wedding is in 2 days. I don't know if I'll ever be able to mail this letter. But if I can, if any opportunity presents itself, I wanted someone to know. I wanted someone to remember that I existed before I became Mrs. Victor Hale, before I disappeared into the role he purchased. Your kindness on the train gave me hope. I'm trying to hold on to it. But hope is hard to maintain when you're surrounded by evidence of what happens to women who dare to have it. Thank you for seeing me when others look through me. Eliza Whitmore." She folded the letter carefully and hid it with Mrs. Davison's address and the $50 at the bottom of her carpet bag. A small rebellion, a tiny assertion that she was still herself, still capable of connection beyond these walls. But as night fell and she lay in bed listening to the wind, Eliza knew the truth. In 2 days, she would stand before a judge and promise obedience to a man who saw her as livestock. She would sign her name one final time, and Eliza Whitmore would cease to exist. In her place would stand Mrs. Victor Hale, owned, controlled, and expected to produce heirs or die trying, just like Margaret before her. The darkness pressed close, and Eliza pressed her hands against her stomach, imagining what Hale expected her to grow there. A son, an heir, a legacy for a man who valued property over people. She closed her eyes and tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. Prayer required hope, and hope required the possibility of change. Out here, in this house, Under Victor Hale's control, change seemed like something that happened to other people in other places. All Eliza had left was time. 2 more days of being herself. Then the wedding. Then the cage door would lock forever, and whatever happened after, survival or destruction, would happen to Mrs. Victor Hale, a woman who didn't exist yet, but soon would. A woman who would learn, as Margaret had learned, that some prisons have no walls because they don't need them. The law itself was wall enough. The 3rd day arrived with a gray dawn that matched Eliza's hollow exhaustion. She'd barely slept, her mind cycling through impossible scenarios, running into the mountains, pleading with the judge, somehow finding leverage against a man who held all the power. Each fantasy collapsed under the weight of reality. By morning, she felt scraped clean, empty of everything except a dull mechanical acceptance. Mrs. Shaw brought breakfast, but Eliza couldn't eat. The housekeeper watched her push eggs around the plate with something that might have been sympathy in another context. "The judge arrives at 2 for the rehearsal," Mrs. Shaw said. "You'll need to be presentable. Mr. Hale expects precision, even in practice." "A rehearsal for signing away my life. How thorough." The housekeeper's expression tightened. "Self-pity won't help you, Miss Whitmore. Save your strength for what matters." "And what matters?" "Surviving tomorrow, and every day after." Mrs. Shaw collected the untouched tray. "The dress arrived an hour ago. Mrs. Pierce outdid herself. It's in the master suite, hanging in what will be your room. You might want to see it before the rehearsal." After the housekeeper left, Eliza sat motionless, staring at the wall. She should feel something: terror, rage, grief. Instead, there was only numbness, a protective shutdown of all the emotions that might break her before the wedding even occurred. Finally, she stood and walked down the hall to the double doors of the master suite. She'd avoided this space during Mrs. Shaw's tour as if not seeing it might delay its claim on her. But delay had run out. She opened the doors. The suite was large, dominated by a 4-poster bed that looked like it belonged in a castle. Heavy curtains framed the windows. The furniture was dark wood, expensive and imposing. A door on the right led to what Mrs. Shaw had called the wife's room, smaller, connected but separate, designed for the illusion of privacy that could be revoked at will. Eliza entered the wife's room. The wedding dress hung on a stand by the window, white silk gleaming in the pale light. It was beautiful in a cold, formal way. High collar, long sleeves, perfectly fitted. The kind of dress that made a statement about respectability and permanence, just as Mrs. Pierce had promised. Margaret's veil lay draped across the bed. Delicate lace yellowed slightly with age. Eliza touched the silk, feeling its weight. This dress would be photographed, remembered, displayed as evidence of a proper wedding. No one looking at pictures would see the contract underneath, the coercion that had brought her here, the desperation that had made her sign. They would see a bride, another rancher's wife, another woman who'd chosen this life. The lie would be preserved in silver and glass for generations. A knock on the main suite door made her turn. Fletcher's voice called from the hallway. "Miss Whitmore? Mr. Hale asked me to escort you downstairs. The judge has arrived early." Of course he had. Even the schedule conspired against her, stealing the few remaining hours she'd thought she had. Eliza smoothed her dress and walked through the master bedroom, past the bed where Hale would expect her to perform her wifely duties, past the mirror that reflected a woman who looked like a stranger. Fletcher waited in the hall, hat in hand, his expression carefully neutral. "You don't have to do this, you know," he said quietly as they descended the stairs. "You told me I couldn't beat him, that he always wins." I said that's the reality. But sometimes people choose to fight anyway, even when they can't win. Fletcher's voice carried a strange mix of resignation and something that might have been admiration. "I wouldn't blame you if you ran. Hell, I'd help you saddle a horse." Eliza stopped on the landing, staring at him. "You would?" "Maybe. If you asked, if you really meant it." He met her eyes. "But you'd have to leave tonight, Miss Whitmore. After the rehearsal, Hale will have men watching. Tomorrow, after the ceremony, you'll be his wife legally. Running then becomes a different crime with worse consequences." "And running now?" "Still breach of contract, still legal consequences. But at least you'd be free of the marriage itself." Fletcher shifted uncomfortably. "I watched Margaret suffocate in this house for 3 years. Watched her spirit break piece by piece. If you're going to run, do it before you sign the marriage certificate. before it's too late to be anyone except Mrs. Victor Hale. Before Eliza could respond, Hale's voice boomed from the study. Fletcher, is she coming or not? Coming, sir. Fletcher gestured toward the study. Think about what I said. You have until tonight. He walked away, leaving Eliza alone with a possibility she'd thought was impossible. Fletcher would help her. One person in this house of complicit silence would actually help her escape. But escape to what? The same questions that had plagued her on the train resurfaced. The contract, the debts, the certainty of being hunted, caught, destroyed by legal mechanisms designed to protect men like Hale. She entered the study. Judge Carmichael stood by the window, a portly man in his 60s with the comfortable bearing of someone who'd never questioned the system he served. He turned as Eliza entered, his smile professional and empty. Ah, the bride. Miss Whitmore, I presume. Delighted to make your acquaintance. He extended his hand and Eliza shook it, feeling the damp warmth of his palm. Victor has told me so much about you. Has he? She glanced at Hale, who stood behind his desk like a general surveying troops. All good things, of course. He's quite pleased with the arrangement. The judge pulled papers from his satchel. Now, we're here to review the ceremony so tomorrow proceeds smoothly. It's a simple affair. Vows, signatures, pronouncement. Shouldn't take more than 15 minutes. 15 minutes to sign away her entire existence. Let's begin, Hale said. I have business to attend to this afternoon. For the next hour, Judge Carmichael walked them through the ceremony. Stand here. Repeat these words. Sign on this line. He read the vows in a monotone that stripped them of any meaning. Love, honor, obey, till death do us part. Words that sounded like poetry but functioned as chains. Do you understand the vows, Miss Whitmore? The judge asked. I understand what they say. And you enter this marriage willingly? The question hung in the air. This was the moment. She could say no. Could tell the judge about the contract, the coercion, the fact that her choice had been between starvation and this. But Carmichael was looking at her with expectant benevolence, already certain of her answer, already prepared to dismiss any objection as pre-wedding jitters. And Hale was watching with eyes that promised consequences if she disrupted his plans. Yes, Eliza heard herself say. Willingly. Excellent. Then tomorrow at 2 o'clock we'll make it official. Carmichael packed his papers with satisfied efficiency. Victor, always a pleasure. Miss Whitmore, I look forward to pronouncing you husband and wife. After the judge departed, Hale turned to Eliza with something that might have been approval. You did well. No dramatics, no objections. That's what I expect tomorrow. Simple compliance. You'll have it. Good. Now, I have work, dinner at 6 as usual. Afterward, you should retire early. Tomorrow will be demanding, and I expect you to be rested. He sat at his desk, already dismissing her from his attention. Eliza walked out, her mind spinning. Fletcher's offer echoed in her thoughts. Tonight, before it's too late. One chance to choose something other than the path that had been chosen for her. She found Mrs. Shaw in the kitchen, preparing dinner. The housekeeper looked up as Eliza entered. How was the rehearsal? Efficient, like everything else in this house. Eliza sat at the kitchen table watching Mrs. Shaw work. Can I ask you something? You can ask, I may not answer. If you could go back 15 years ago when you first came here, would you still take this job? Knowing what you know now? Mrs. Shaw's hands stilled over the vegetables she was chopping. For a long moment she didn't speak. Then, yes, because the alternative was worse. I was 50, widowed, with no prospects. Victor Hale offered security. That mattered more than morality. She resumed chopping, the knife striking the board with rhythmic precision. But I'm staff. I have boundaries, a salary, the legal right to leave. You won't have any of those things after tomorrow. So you think I should run? The housekeeper looked up sharply. I didn't say that, but you're thinking it. What I think doesn't matter. What matters is what you can live with. Mrs. Shaw set down the knife. Margaret couldn't live with it. She tried for 3 years, and it destroyed her. You might be stronger. You might survive what she couldn't, but you might not. Her voice dropped. Only you can decide if survival under Hale's terms is worth having. And if I run, if I break the contract, then he'll hunt you. Use every legal mechanism available. Make an example of you. Mrs. Shaw's expression was unreadable.
but at least you'll have chosen your own destruction instead of accepting his. The words settled between them like a gauntlet thrown down. Choose your own destruction. It was a bleak kind of freedom, but freedom nonetheless. Eliza left the kitchen and returned to her room. The afternoon sun slanted through the window, casting long shadows. Outside, ranch hands moved through their work, oblivious to the decision taking shape inside the house. She pulled out her carpet bag and stared at its meager contents. The letter to Mrs. Davison, the address, $50. Everything she owned in the world, fitting easily into a bag she could carry one-handed. Fletcher had said he would help her saddle a horse, but where would she ride? Silver Ridge was 23 miles away, and from there, the nearest real city was hundreds of miles distant. Winter was brutal. The landscape was unforgiving. She had no survival skills, no knowledge of the territory, no plan beyond the desperate impulse to escape. And yet, the alternative was standing before Judge Carmichael tomorrow, speaking vows that would seal her into a life of servitude and forced pregnancy until her body gave out or provided the heir Hale demanded. The alternative was becoming Margaret, watching herself disappear piece by piece until death came as a relief. Eliza sat on the bed, holding the carpet bag, feeling the weight of impossible choices. Every option led to destruction. The only question was whether she would destroy herself through compliance or defiance. Evening fell. Mrs. Shaw called her to dinner. Eliza descended the stairs for what might be the last meal in this house, knowing she had to decide soon. Tonight. Before morning brought the wedding and the final cage door locked into place. Dinner was torturous. Hale talked about tomorrow's ceremony, the guests who would attend. Mrs. Brennan and her husband, Fletcher, and the senior ranch hands, Mrs. Pierce, and several townspeople from Silver Ridge. A small gathering, but sufficient witnesses to make the marriage legal and binding. "I've arranged for photographs," Hale said, cutting his steak with precise movements. "Records are important. I want documentation of the event." Documentation of ownership, Eliza thought. Proof of transaction. "You're quiet tonight," Hale observed. "Just tired. The rehearsal was draining. Tomorrow will be more so, but afterward, you'll have time to adjust to your new role." His gaze lingered on her with that clinical assessment. "I'll expect you to fulfill your wifely duties beginning tomorrow night. No delays, no excuses. The sooner we establish the marriage properly, the better." Eliza's stomach turned. She set down her fork, unable to continue the pretense of eating. "May I be excused? I'd like to retire early, as you suggested." Hale nodded. "Of course. Rest well, Miss Whitmore. Tomorrow, you become Mrs. Hale." She fled upstairs, her heart hammering. In her room, she pressed her back against the door and tried to breathe. Tomorrow night. He'd said it so casually, as if claiming her body was just another item on a schedule. No consideration for her feelings, her readiness, her humanity. Just expectations and demands and the legal right to enforce both. A soft knock made her jump. She opened the door to find Fletcher in the hallway, his expression grim. "I brought your bag from the porch," he said, though she could see he carried nothing. "Thought you might need it tonight." They stared at each other, the unspoken offer hanging between them. "If someone were leaving," Eliza said carefully, "how would they do it?" They'd wait until the house was asleep. Around midnight, everyone settled. They'd go to the barn, the east entrance, away from the bunkhouse. They'd find a horse already saddled, provisions in the saddlebag. They'd ride west, toward the mountains. There's a trail that leads to a mining camp about 40 miles out. From there, they could catch a supply wagon headed to Helena. And if someone followed, I'd make sure no one noticed the missing horse until dawn. By then, they'd have a 6-hour head start. Fletcher's voice was barely a whisper. But it's winter. The trail's dangerous. The cold could kill faster than any pursuit. Why would you help me? Risk your job, maybe worse. Fletcher looked away, jaw tight. Because I didn't help Margaret. When she begged me to get her away from here, I told her the same things I told you, that it was impossible, that Hale would find her, that running would make things worse, so she stayed. And she died. He met Eliza's eyes. I won't watch that happen twice. If I go, he'll know you helped. Maybe, maybe not. I'll claim the horse spooked and broke free. He'll suspect, but he can't prove it. Fletcher stepped back. The choice is yours, Miss Whitmore. Stay and survive, or run and take your chances. Either way, I've said my piece.
He disappeared down the hallway, leaving Eliza alone with the decision that could no longer be delayed. She returned to her room and sat by the window, watching the moon rise over the mountains. The ranch settled into night. Lights dimming in the bunkhouse, the barn falling silent, the house growing quiet as Hale retreated to his study, and Mrs. Shaw to her quarters near the kitchen. Midnight approached. Eliza packed her carpet bag with shaking hands, the letter, the money, an extra shawl, the few personal items she possessed. She changed into her warmest clothes, layering everything she owned. The wedding dress hung in the master suite, pristine and waiting. She looked at it one last time and felt nothing. Let it hang there forever, a monument to a marriage that never happened. The clock downstairs chimed midnight. Eliza shouldered her bag, opened her door, and listened. The house was silent except for the usual creaks and settling. She crept down the hallway, avoiding the board she knew squeaked from Mrs. Shaw's tour. Past Margaret's portrait, past the closed door of Hale's study, down the stairs with agonizing slowness. The kitchen, the back door, her hand on the latch. She paused, looking back at the house that had almost become her prison. Then she opened the door and stepped into the freezing night. The cold hit like a fist, stealing her breath. She forced herself forward, across the yard toward the barns. Every shadow seemed to hide watching eyes. Every sound was a potential alarm, but nothing moved except the wind, and she reached the barn's east entrance without encountering anyone. Inside, the horses shifted in their stalls, disturbed by the late visitor. Eliza stood in the darkness, heart pounding, until her eyes adjusted. There, just as Fletcher had promised, a horse stood saddled and ready, tied near the back entrance. Saddlebags hung heavy with provisions. She approached slowly, murmuring soft reassurances. The horse, a sturdy mare with a calm temperament, accepted her presence. Eliza checked the saddlebags. Dried meat, hardtack, a canteen of water, matches, a knife. Fletcher had thought of everything. She was untying the reins when a voice froze her in place. "Going somewhere, Miss Whitmore?" Eliza spun. Mrs. Shaw stood in the barn entrance, wrapped in a heavy shawl, her face shadowed but her voice clear. Terror and betrayal flooded through Eliza. Save your explanations." Mrs. Shaw moved closer, and in the moonlight filtering through the slats, her expression was unreadable. "I saw Fletcher preparing this horse earlier, knew what it meant. Are you going to stop me?" "No." The housekeeper pulled something from beneath her shawl, a bundle wrapped in cloth. "I'm going to help you. This is bread, cheese, dried fruit, more than Fletcher packed. The trail's long and you'll need every bit of food you can carry." Eliza stared, unable to process this unexpected alliance. "Why?" "Because I told you I stayed for security. But that was only half true." Mrs. Shaw's voice cracked. "I stayed because I was a coward. Because watching Margaret die was easier than risking my position to help her. I've lived with that shame for 2 years. I won't live with it again." She thrust the bundle into Eliza's hands, then added a heavy coat. "This was Margaret's. Hale never noticed when I kept it instead of donating it with her other things. It's warmer than what you're wearing." Eliza pulled on the coat, feeling the weight and warmth of it, feeling the ghost of the woman who'd worn it before. "If he finds out you helped, he won't. And if he does, I'm old enough that starting over somewhere else isn't impossible." Mrs. Shaw helped secure the provisions to the saddle. "Now listen carefully. Follow the trail west into the mountains. 40 miles to the mining camp. It's called Sterling Creek. Ask for a man named Jack Morrison. Tell him Sarah Shaw sent you. He owes me a favor, and he'll get you on a supply wagon to Helena. Helena's not far enough. Hale will search there. From Helena, you can catch a train anywhere. Use that money you've got hidden. Get to a big city, Denver, San Francisco, somewhere Hale's influence doesn't reach. Change your name. Start completely new." Mrs. Shaw gripped Eliza's shoulders. "Don't hesitate. Don't look back. Don't let guilt or fear slow you down. Just ride and keep riding until you're free of this place." Tears burned Eliza's eyes. "Thank you. Thank me by surviving. Thank me by becoming someone Margaret never got the chance to be." Mrs. Shaw stepped back. "Now go, before the night gets any older." Eliza mounted the horse, adjusting the unfamiliar weight of the saddlebags. The mare shifted beneath her, sensing her rider's nervousness. "One more thing," Mrs. Shaw said. There's a storm coming. You can smell it in the air. It'll hit by dawn. Cover your tracks. That's fortune smiling on you. Use it." Eliza nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She turned the horse toward the barn's back exit, toward the trail that led to the mountains in some desperate approximation of freedom. "Miss Whitmore?" Mrs. Shaw called softly. Eliza looked back. "Ride fast. Ride far. And when you're somewhere safe, write to that address you've got hidden in your bag. Let someone know you made it. Let someone know that one woman escaped Victor Hale's cage." Then the housekeeper faded into the shadows, returning to the house where she would lie and misdirect and play innocent when the alarm was raised. Eliza kicked the mare into motion. They emerged from the barn into the freezing night, and she pointed the horse west toward the mountains visible as black shapes against the starlit sky. The ranch fell away behind her, the house with its lights extinguished, the bunkhouse silent, the land that Victor Hale believed he owned, including everyone on it. But he didn't own her, not anymore. The contract was broken, the wedding canceled, the cage door left standing open. She rode through the darkness, following a trail that was barely visible, trusting the horse's instincts when her own failed. The cold cut through even Margaret's heavy coat. Her hands went numb on the reins, but she pushed forward because stopping meant freezing, and freezing meant death or capture, both of which were unacceptable. The mountains loomed closer. The trail began to climb, rocky and treacherous in the darkness. Eliza had never ridden this far, never pushed through exhaustion this profound. Every part of her body ached. The fear that had propelled her out of the barn began to give way to a different fear. That Fletcher's head start wouldn't be enough. That Hale's men were already riding after her. That she'd made a fatal mistake. But she didn't turn back. Couldn't turn back. Behind her was only the life she'd rejected, the marriage she'd refused, the future where her choices didn't matter because someone else had already made them for her. Ahead was uncertainty, danger, the very real possibility of dying from exposure or starvation, or falling from a trail she couldn't properly see. But ahead was also freedom, self-determination, the chance to become someone other than Mrs. Victor Hale. The storm Mrs. Shaw had predicted began as dawn approached. First a few flakes, then a torrent. Snow falling so thick it erased the trail, the mountains, everything beyond the horse's ears. Visibility dropped to nothing. The wind rose, howling through the pines, driving snow into Eliza's face until she could barely breathe. She wrapped herself in Margaret's coat and bent low over the horse's neck, trusting the mare to find the path. Time became meaningless. Minutes or hours passing in a white void where only the horse's steady movement suggested they were making any progress at all. The cold penetrated deeper. Eliza's fingers lost all feeling. Her face went numb. Exhaustion pulled at her consciousness, whispering that she should rest, just for a moment, close her eyes and let the cold take her. But she'd chosen this, chosen the risk of death over the certainty of living death. So she forced her eyes open, forced herself to stay conscious, forced the horse onward through the storm. Somewhere behind them, perhaps at the ranch, perhaps already on the trail, Victor Hale was waking to discover his purchased bride had fled. She could imagine his rage, his orders shouted to Fletcher, and the hands, his certainty that she wouldn't get far. He was wrong. She would get as far as her will, and this horse could carry her. And if she died out here in the storm, frozen solid on a mountain trail, at least she'd die as Eliza Whitmore. Not as property, not as livestock, not as a woman whose only value was measured in her capacity to breed. The horse stumbled and Eliza jerked fully awake, realizing she'd been dozing in the saddle. Death by freezing, they said, was gentle at the end, a slow fade into sleep. She couldn't allow it, not yet, not when freedom might be just miles ahead. "Keep going," she whispered to the horse, to herself, to the storm. "Just keep going." And the mare did, plodding through snow that was now knee-deep, following some instinct or memory of trails past. The world was white and wind and cold beyond anything Eliza had imagined. But somewhere ahead was Sterling Creek and Jack Morrison, and a chance to truly escape. She clung to that possibility like a lifeline as the storm raged and dawn broke unseen behind the clouds, and the frozen miles stretched endless before her. The storm finally broke near midday, though Eliza had lost all sense of time. The wind died first, then the snow thinned to scattered flakes, and suddenly she could see more than 5 feet ahead. The trail had vanished under 2 feet of fresh powder, but the mare seemed to know where she was going, picking her way between pine trees laden with snow, climbing steadily into mountains that looked even more forbidding in daylight than they had in darkness. Eliza's body had gone beyond cold into a strange numbness where pain became abstract. Her hands were locked around the reins in a grip she couldn't release even if she'd wanted to. Her face felt like carved ice, but she was alive, and she was moving, and behind her the storm had erased every trace of her passage. The sun emerged, pale and cold, turning the landscape into blinding white. She squinted against the glare, trying to gauge how far she'd come. The ranch was invisible behind miles and mountains. No pursuit was visible in any direction. Either the storm had stopped Hale's men, or they were hours behind, or they'd assumed she couldn't possibly survive and had turned back. None of those possibilities meant safety, just temporary reprieve. The trail descended into a narrow valley, and Eliza saw smoke rising ahead. Her heart leaped. Civilization, shelter, hope. But caution made her slow the mare's pace. This could be the mining camp Mrs. Shaw had mentioned, or it could be something else entirely. She needed to approach carefully, assess before revealing herself. As she drew closer, she saw buildings scattered along a frozen creek, rough structures built for function rather than comfort, tailored to men who dug wealth from stone and spent it as fast as they earned it. A few figures moved between buildings, bundled against the cold. The camp looked small, maybe 24 men working claims in the surrounding hills. Eliza guided the mare toward what appeared to be the largest building, a long structure with smoke pouring from a stone chimney. A sign hung crooked above the door. Sterling Creek Supply. This had to be the place Mrs. Shaw meant. She dismounted, her legs nearly buckling when her feet hit the ground. Pain shot through her frozen joints as circulation struggled to return. She tied the mare to a post and stumbled toward the door, pushing it open with a shoulder because her hands wouldn't work. Heat hit her like a wall. A pot-bellied stove dominated the center of the room, radiating blessed warmth. Shelves lined the walls stocked with supplies, canned goods, mining equipment, rope, tools. 3 men sat near the stove, playing cards and passing a bottle. They looked up as Eliza entered, their conversation dying. "Help you, miss?" The oldest of them stood, a man in his 50s with a weathered face and cautious eyes. He took in her appearance with growing concern. "You look half frozen." "I'm looking for Jack Morrison." Eliza's voice came out as a croak. "Sarah Shaw sent me." The man's expression shifted immediately. "I'm Morrison. Sarah Shaw, you said." He moved toward her, gesturing to his companions. "Tom, get her some coffee. Bill, take care of her horse. Looks like it's been ridden hard." One man hurried to pour coffee from a pot on the stove, while the other went outside. Morrison guided Eliza to a chair near the fire, and she collapsed into it, shaking violently as her body tried to process the transition from deadly cold to warmth. "Drink this." Tom pressed a tin cup into her hands. The coffee was bitter and scalding, and Eliza had never tasted anything better. She drank it in gulps, feeling warmth spread through her chest. Morrison pulled up a chair, studying her with sharp intelligence. "You rode from the Hale Ranch." It wasn't a question. Eliza nodded. "Through last night's storm." Another nod. "Then you're either the luckiest woman alive or the most determined." Morrison glanced at his companion. "Tom, get her some food. She looks like she hasn't eaten in days." "Just since yesterday." Eliza set down the empty cup, her hands finally responding to mental commands. "But it feels longer." Tom brought a plate of bread and cold meat. Eliza ate mechanically, too hungry to taste anything, while Morrison waited with the patience of someone accustomed to hearing difficult stories. Finally, he spoke. "Sarah Shaw doesn't send people my way unless they're running from something bad. You want to tell me what happened?" Eliza looked at him. This stranger who owed Mrs. Shaw a favor, whose camp represented her first stop on a journey that might end in capture or freedom. She made a calculation. Trust him or lie? Both carried risk. "Victor Hale purchased a bride," she said quietly. "I was supposed to marry him yesterday. I chose not to." Morrison's jaw tightened. "He purchased, you mean one of those debt contracts?" "My father died owing money. The contract was my way out of starvation, or so I thought." She met his eyes. "But when I got to the ranch, I learned what happened to his first wife. What he expected from me. and I realize some things are worse than starving. Margaret, Morrison's voice was grim. I heard about her death, heard the whispers. Victor Hale is a powerful man, but power doesn't make a person decent. He'll come after me. He's probably already searching. The storm bought you time, trails wiped clean for 20 miles. By the time his men get here, you'll be gone. Morrison stood, pacing. There's a supply wagon leaving for Helena tomorrow morning. I can get you on it. From Helena, you'll have options, trains, coaches, places to disappear. He'll search Helena, eventually, but it's a city, easier to hide in crowds than out here in the territory. Morrison returned to his chair. You got money? Eliza nodded. Some, not much. It'll be enough to get you started somewhere. Change your name, find work, build a new life. He paused. But you need to understand, Hale won't let this go quietly. A man like that, he'll see your escape as theft. He paid for you in his mind, and you defaulted on the contract. He'll use every legal mechanism he can to force your return or punish you for leaving. I know. Eliza's voice was steady despite her exhaustion. But I'd rather spend my life running than spend it as his property. Morrison studied her for a long moment, then nodded. You've got steel in you. Good. You'll need it. He called to Tom. Get the back room ready. She needs rest before the wagon leaves. And Tom, no one knows she's here. Anyone asks, we haven't seen anyone from the Hale Ranch. Tom disappeared into the back of the building. Morrison turned back to Eliza. The wagon leaves at dawn. That gives you about 18 hours to rest and recover. Use them. The journey to Helena takes 3 days in good weather, longer if there's more snow. Thank you. Eliza's throat tightened with gratitude. Why are you helping me? Because Sarah Shaw asked. And because I once saw what happens when powerful men treat women like livestock. His expression darkened with memory. My sister was in a situation similar to yours, years back. Different circumstances, same fundamental problem. A man who believed ownership papers gave him the right to destroy someone. She didn't escape, drank poison rather than face another day of it. The weight of that confession hung between them. Eliza understood she was receiving help paid for by someone else's tragedy. Another woman who'd found no way out except the permanent kind. I'm sorry about your sister. So am I, every day. Morrison stood. Come on, let's get you settled. You're safe here, at least for tonight. He led her to a small room in the back, barely more than a closet with a cot and a blanket, but it was private and warm. Eliza sank onto the cot, her body finally admitting the toll the last 12 hours had taken. Morrison brought more coffee and food, then left her alone. She lay down, intending to rest for just a moment, and fell into deep, dreamless sleep. When she woke, disoriented and confused, the light through the high window suggested late afternoon. She'd slept for hours. Panic surged. Had she missed the wagon? Was Hale's posse already at the camp? She stumbled out of the room to find Morrison and several other men sitting around the stove. They looked up as she appeared. Easy, Morrison said. You needed the rest. Nothing's happened. No one's come through asking questions. How long until the wagon leaves? 14 hours. You've got time, he gestured to a chair. Sit. We saved you dinner. The men made space for her near the fire. They were miners, she learned. Rough men with rough manners, but their treatment of her was carefully respectful. They asked no invasive questions, offered no judgment, simply shared their meal and their warmth. As the evening progressed, Eliza began to feel almost human again. The food and rest restored her, and the heat from the stove finally penetrated the bone-deep cold that had settled in her during the ride. She contributed little to the conversation, content to listen to the men discuss claims and equipment and the brutal work of extracting silver from unforgiving stone. Around 9 o'clock, Bill, the man who'd cared for her horse, came inside with news that made everyone fall silent. Riders coming up the valley, maybe 6 of them. Eliza's blood went cold. Morrison stood immediately, his hand on her shoulder. Back room. Now, don't make a sound. She fled to the small room while the men arranged themselves casually around the stove, picking up cards and conversation as if nothing unusual had happened. Eliza pressed herself against the wall, her heart hammering so loud she was certain it would give her away. Voices outside. The door opening. Heavy boots on the wooden floor. Evening, gentlemen. The voice was unfamiliar but carried authority.
We're looking for someone who might have passed through here. A woman traveling alone. Dark hair, about 23 years old. Would have been riding hard, probably looked half frozen. Morrison's voice, casual and unhelpful. Haven't seen anyone like that. Storm kept everyone inside last night. We've been playing cards since noon.
You're certain this woman is wanted for breach of contract. There's a reward for information leading to her recovery. How much? That was Tom, playing his role perfectly. Just interested enough to seem credible, not so interested as to seem suspicious. $50? A low whistle. That's good money. But I'm telling you, we haven't seen her. You might try the camps further north. If someone was running, they'd probably head deeper into the mountains.
Silence. Eliza could imagine the man, one of Hale's riders probably, assessing Morrison and his companions, trying to determine if they were lying.
She held her breath, praying the back room's door would go unnoticed. We'll check those camps, the rider finally said. But if she shows up here, you send word immediately. Victor Hale doesn't forget people who help him. He also doesn't forget people who hinder him. Understood. We see her. We'll let you know. More footsteps, the door closing. Eliza waited, not moving, barely breathing. Minutes passed. Finally, Morrison appeared in the doorway. They're gone. Rode north like I suggested. He smiled grimly. That bought you more time. They'll waste hours checking the other camps before they realize you're not there. Eliza's legs gave out. She sat on the cot, shaking. They were so close. But they didn't find you. That's what matters. Morrison crouched beside her. Listen to me. This is going to keep happening until you're far enough away that Hale can't reach. Every town, every camp, every station, you'll be looking over your shoulder. The question is whether you can live with that. Yes. Eliza's voice was stronger than she felt. I can live with fear. I couldn't live as his wife. Then we stick to the plan. Dawn, the wagon leaves. You'll be hidden in the supply shipment. The driver, name's Pete Carver, he owes me, and he'll get you to Helena without asking questions. From there, you're on your own. The rest of the night passed in tense vigilance. The men took turns watching the trail, ensuring Hale's riders didn't return. Eliza tried to rest but couldn't sleep, adrenaline and fear keeping her alert. She reviewed her escape plan obsessively. The wagon to Helena, a train from there to somewhere far away. A new name, a new life. If she could just get to Helena without being caught, she might actually survive this. Dawn came gray and cold. Morrison woke her before the sun rose, and she packed her few belongings quickly. The supply wagon stood in the yard loaded with crates and barrels. Pete Carver, a lean man with kind eyes, waited beside it. Miss Whitmore. He touched his hat. Morrison explained the situation. I'll get you to Helena safe. You'll ride in the back, hidden under the cargo tarps. It won't be comfortable, but it'll keep you out of sight. Thank you. Morrison pulled her aside while Carver made final preparations. Once you're in Helena, head to the train station. Buy a ticket to Denver or San Francisco, somewhere big enough that you can disappear. Use a false name from this point forward. Don't contact anyone from your past, not even that woman who helped you on the train. Hale will monitor known associates. What about Mrs. Shaw? She risked everything to help me. Sarah can take care of herself. She survived Victor Hale this long. She'll survive his anger when he figures out she helped you. Morrison pressed something into her hand. Additional money, maybe $30. For emergencies. Don't argue. My sister never got help when she needed it. Maybe this balances the scales a little. Eliza's eyes burned with tears. I don't know how to thank you. Live. Build a good life. That's thanks enough. He helped her into the wagon bed, arranging cargo around her to create a hidden space. Stay quiet. Stay hidden. Pete will let you out when it's safe. The tarp came down, plunging her into darkness. She heard Morrison wish Carver safe travels, heard the driver climb onto the seat, heard the reins snap and the horses start forward. The wagon lurched and bounced over rough ground, heading down the mountain toward Helena and whatever came next. The journey was exactly as uncomfortable as Carver had warned. Eliza lay cramped between crates, unable to move, breathing stale air that smelled of canvas and dried goods. The wagon's constant motion made her nauseous. Hours passed in blind darkness while she tried to track their progress by sound and sensation. They stopped once during the first day. Eliza heard voices, Carver talking to someone, casual conversation that didn't sound threatening. Then they were moving again, and she allowed herself to hope that maybe, possibly, she might actually escape. Night brought relief. Carver stopped to make camp, and when he pulled back the tarp, Eliza gasped in the fresh air like a drowning woman reaching the surface. "You all right?" Carver asked, helping her out. "I know it's rough traveling that way." "I'm fine." She stretched cramped muscles, looking around. They were in a clearing surrounded by pine forest, no buildings or people visible. "Where are we?" "About halfway to Helena. We'll camp here tonight, get moving again at first light." Well, Carver was already building a fire. "You can sleep in the open tonight. No one travels these roads after dark in winter." They ate a simple meal, beans and hardtack, while the fire crackled and stars emerged overhead. Carver was a quiet man, comfortable with silence, and Eliza was grateful not to have to maintain conversation. Her mind was too full of what lay behind and what lay ahead. "You really ran from Victor Hale," Carver said eventually. It wasn't a question, but Eliza nodded anyway. "I did." "That takes nerve. Most women in your position figure they've got no choice." "I had a choice. It was just between two terrible options. I chose the one where I stayed myself." Carver poked at the fire. "My wife died 5 years back. Childbirth. The baby, too." His voice was matter-of-fact, but pain lurked beneath. "I understand what you're running from, that desperate need for an heir, that willingness to sacrifice everything, including the woman, to get it. It's evil dressed up as tradition. I'm sorry about your wife." "So am I. Every day." He looked at her across the fire. "But her death taught me something. There's no legacy worth having if it's built on someone else's suffering. Hale doesn't understand that. Probably never will." They fell silent, both lost in thoughts of people who died trying to meet impossible expectations. Finally, Carver banked the fire and they settled in for the night. Him near the wagon, her wrapped in blankets under the stars. Eliza stared up at the constellations her mother had taught her. Cassiopeia, still fixed in the northern sky. The stars didn't care about human drama, didn't notice one woman fleeing across the frontier. They'd shine whether she made it to Helena or was dragged back to Hale's ranch. The indifference was somehow comforting. If the universe didn't care, then maybe the stakes weren't as cosmically huge as they felt. Maybe she was just a person making choices. Maybe that was enough. The second day was harder. Back under the tarp, back in darkness, back to the cramped uncertainty. But around midday, the wagon's character changed. The road grew smoother, sounds of other traffic emerged, and Eliza knew they were approaching civilization. When Carver finally stopped and lifted the tarp, Eliza found herself looking at a city. Helena sprawled before her, wooden buildings crowding together, streets busy with wagons and pedestrians, the organized chaos of a territorial capital. It was beautiful simply for being anonymous. Here, she could disappear into crowds. Here, Victor Hale was just another angry man with a grievance, not the all-powerful force he seemed in Silver Ridge. "Train station's 3 blocks that way," Carver said, pointing. "Get your ticket and get gone. Don't linger, don't draw attention. And Miss Whitmore?" "Yes?" "Good luck, you're going to need it." She thanked him, gathered her carpet bag, and stepped down from the wagon. The street was busy, people moving with purpose, no one paying her any attention. She pulled Margaret's coat tight and walked toward the train station, trying to look like she belonged. The station was crowded with travelers. Eliza joined the line for the ticket window, her heart racing every time the door opened, certain she'd see Hale's men coming for her. But no one looked twice at the tired young woman with a worn carpet bag. She was invisible here, just another person going somewhere. "Where to?" the ticket agent asked when she finally reached the window. "San Francisco." The destination sprang to her lips unbidden, as far from Montana as she could get without leaving the country. $22. Eliza counted out the money, Mrs. Davison's $50, Morrison's $30, plus her original $3. She had $61 left after the ticket, enough to survive for a while if she was careful. The agent handed her the ticket. "Train leaves in 2 hours. Track 3. 2 hours. She bought food from a vendor, bread, cheese, and apple, and found a bench in a corner where she could watch the doors. Every minute felt like an eternity. Every man who entered might be one of Hale's riders. Every uniform might belong to a lawman with a warrant. But nothing happened. The station clock ticked toward departure. Other passengers gathered on track 3. Eliza joined them, trying to blend in, trying to look like someone with a right to be there. The train pulled in with a hiss of steam. Passengers boarded. Eliza found a seat in a crowded car, wedged between a woman with a baby and an elderly man who fell asleep immediately. She pressed her face to the window, watching Helena through the glass. The whistle blew. The train lurched forward, and slowly, impossibly, Helena began to fall away. Eliza watched until the city disappeared behind hills, until she was certain no one was chasing the train, until she finally allowed herself to believe she might actually escape. She pulled out the letter she'd written to Mrs. Davison, added a few lines about making it to Helena and heading to San Francisco, and tucked it back in her bag. She'd mail it when she was settled, when enough time and distance made her feel safe. The train carried her west through country she'd never seen, past mountains and forests and endless sky. She dozed fitfully, waking at every stop, checking to make sure no one was boarding who looked like they were searching for someone. But the stops came and went without incident. Night fell. The train rocked and swayed through darkness. And Eliza finally slept, deep and dreamless, the exhaustion of 5 days catching up to her all at once. When she woke, pale light was filtering through the windows, and the landscape had changed. The mountains had given way to different terrain, still wild, still beautiful, but heading toward the coast and the ocean and a city where she could truly disappear. The woman with the baby smiled at her. "First time to San Francisco?" "Yes." Eliza's voice was rusty from sleep. "You'll love it. It's a fresh start kind of place. Lots of people reinventing themselves out there." Reinventing. That's exactly what Eliza intended to do. Eliza Whitmore was gone, dead, lost, married to Victor Hale in some alternate timeline. In San Francisco, she'd be someone new, someone without contracts or debts, or men who believed they owned her. The train rolled on, carrying her toward that future. Behind her, miles and mountains separated her from the ranch, from Hale's rage, from the wedding that never happened. Ahead was uncertainty, but it was her uncertainty, her choice, her life. For the first time since her father died, Eliza felt something that might have been hope, not the naive hope of rescue or easy solutions, but the harder, more durable hope that came from choosing your own path, even when all paths led through darkness. She was free, truly, terrifyingly free. And whatever came next, she would face it as herself, not as property, not as a contract, not as someone's purchased bride, just as Eliza. That would have to be enough. The train carried her west, and she led it, watching the landscape change and knowing she was changing with it, becoming someone new with every mile that passed between her past and her future. San Francisco hit Eliza like a revelation. The train pulled into the station 3 days after leaving Helena, and she stepped onto the platform into a world so different from Montana territory that it might as well have been a different country. The air tasted of salt and fog. Buildings crowded together in impossible density. People moved in rivers, Chinese merchants, Italian fishermen, society women in fine dresses, rough miners spending their fortunes, all flowing together in glorious, anonymous chaos. She could disappear here. She would disappear here. The first week passed in survival mode. Eliza found a boarding house on the edge of the Barbary Coast. Cheap, slightly dangerous, but anonymous. The landlady, Mrs. Chen, asked no questions beyond, "Can you pay?" When Eliza counted out a week's rent, Mrs. Chen handed her a key to a room barely larger than the one at Hale's ranch. But this one came without locks she didn't control. She changed her name that first day, casually and completely. The boarding house register read Elizabeth Crane in her careful handwriting. Elizabeth felt close enough to Eliza that she'd remember to answer to it. Crane was borrowed from a street sign she'd passed. Together, they created someone new, someone without a history trailing behind her like chains. The second week, Elizabeth Crane found work. A textile factory near the waterfront hired women with no references if they could prove they knew the work. Eliza's years in Chicago factories had taught her more than she'd realized. Her fingers remembered the rhythm of machinery, the monotony of repetition. The foreman hired her on the spot. The work was hard. 14-hour days in a building that shook with the clatter of looms. The pay was meager, barely enough to cover rent and food, but it was her work, her wages, her choice. No one owned her labor except herself. That made even the most exhausting day feel like freedom. She sent the letter to Mrs. Davison from a post office in Chinatown, using her new name, carefully omitting any details that might lead someone back to her. Just a note saying she'd escaped, she was safe, and she was grateful. She included no return address. Winter softened into spring. The fog lifted earlier each morning, revealing a city that never stopped building, never stopped growing, never stopped offering second chances to people willing to work for them. Elizabeth, she'd begun thinking of herself that way now, Eliza receding into memory, fell into a routine that felt almost like living rather than merely surviving. She made a friend at the factory. Mary O'Brien, an Irish immigrant with quick hands and a quicker wit, took Elizabeth under her wing during the first brutal month. They worked side by side at the looms, shared meals in the boarding house kitchen, occasionally splurged on Sunday walks along the Embarcadero, where they could watch ships come and go from every corner of the world. "You never talk about before," Mary observed one Sunday as they sat on a dock eating bread and cheese. "Before San Francisco, I mean. Where'd you come from?" Elizabeth had prepared for this question. "Chicago. My family died. Nothing left for me there." "Same story as half this city." Mary tossed a crust to a seagull. "That's what I like about San Francisco. Nobody cares who you were. Only matters who you are now." It was true. In the boarding house, in the factory, on the streets, no one asked invasive questions. Everyone carried secrets. Everyone had fled something or was running towards something else. The city absorbed them all with magnificent indifference. But at night, alone in her small room, Elizabeth's guard dropped. She dreamed of the ranch, of Hale's cold assessment, of the wedding dress hanging pristine in a room she'd never enter as a bride. She dreamed of Mrs. Shaw and Fletcher, wondering if they'd faced consequences for helping her. She dreamed of Margaret's portrait, those sad eyes that had tried to warn her. And sometimes she dreamed she'd made the wrong choice, that she should have stayed, should have married Hale, should have accepted the cage as the price of security. In those dreams, she was back on the trail in the storm, freezing to death alone, and she woke gasping with the certainty that survival had been nothing but temporary reprieve. But morning always came, bringing with it the factory bell and Mary's cheerful irreverence in the city's constant noise. The dreams faded. Life continued. And slowly, carefully, Elizabeth began to believe she might actually make it. 3 months after arriving in San Francisco, everything changed. She was walking home from the factory, exhausted and covered in lint, when she saw him. Victor Hale, standing on the corner of Market Street, talking to a man in a lawman's uniform. Elizabeth's heart stopped. She ducked into a doorway, pressing herself against the wall, terror flooding through her body, with such force she thought she might collapse. This was impossible. San Francisco was hundreds of miles from Silver Ridge. How had he found her? Had someone betrayed her location? Was this the end of everything? She forced herself to look again, more carefully. The man on the corner turned slightly, and Elizabeth saw his face clearly. It wasn't Hale. Just someone with similar height and build, same expensive clothes, same bearing of a man accustomed to command. Not Hale at all. Just her fear making phantoms real. She leaned against the doorway, shaking. This was how she would live now, jumping at shadows, seeing threats and strangers, never quite believing she was safe. The price of freedom was eternal vigilance. She could accept that price, but she couldn't pretend it wasn't exhausting. "You all right, miss?" A passing gentleman paused, concerned by her obvious distress. "Fine. Just felt dizzy for a moment. This city's heat can be surprising. You should rest." He moved on, and Elizabeth continued home, walking fast, head down, avoiding eye contact. That night, she barely slept, certain that seeing someone who looked like Hale was an omen, a warning that her escape had been temporary and capture was imminent. But days passed without incident, then weeks. The phantom Hale didn't reappear. No lawmen came to the boarding house asking questions. The factory remained a refuge of anonymity and hard work. Elizabeth's panic subsided into the background hum of constant low-level anxiety she'd learned to live with. Summer arrived, bringing with it opportunities. The factory where Elizabeth worked expanded, and the foreman promoted her to a training position, teaching new workers the machinery, earning an extra $1 a week. It wasn't much, but it meant she could move from Mrs. Chen's boarding house to slightly better accommodations. A room with a window that actually opened. A landlady who didn't water down the soup. Mary moved with her, and they shared a 2-room apartment above a bakery. The smell of fresh bread woke them each morning. Expensive bread they couldn't afford, but the smell was free and almost as satisfying as eating it would have been. "We're moving up in the world," Mary joked as they arranged their meager possessions in the new space. "Next thing you know, we'll be society ladies with calling cards and parasols. I'd settle for a day off that doesn't feel like a luxury we're stealing." "Now that's ambition." Mary flopped onto her bed, staring at the ceiling. "You ever think about what's next? Beyond the factory, I mean." "Sometimes." Elizabeth sat by the window, looking out at the street below. "I think about having my own business someday. A dress shop maybe, or a boarding house for working women. Something that's mine." "You'd be good at that. You've got the spine for it."
Mary propped herself on one elbow. "Most girls who come through the factory, they're just marking time until they marry. But you've got the look of someone building something permanent." Elizabeth didn't respond, because explaining why marriage wasn't in her future meant explaining why she'd fled Montana Territory, and that meant risking someone putting pieces together.
So she just smiled and changed the subject, and Mary let it drop, because that's what friends did in a city built on other people's secrets. The months accumulated. Summer turned to fall. Elizabeth's savings grew slowly. $50, then $75, then an entire $100 hidden in a tin under her floorboards. Not enough to start a business, but enough to feel like she was building towards something rather than just surviving day to day. She began attending a women's suffrage meeting on Sunday evenings, drawn by curiosity and Mary's insistence. The meetings were held in a church basement and attended by working women, society reformers, and a few brave men who believed women deserved the vote. Elizabeth found herself fascinated by the discussions of rights and representation, of laws that treated women as property, and the fight to change those laws. One evening, a lawyer named Charlotte Green spoke about marriage contracts and women's legal status. She described cases she'd taken on, women trapped by debt contracts, by abusive husbands, by laws that gave them no recourse and no escape. She talked about fighting those cases in court, about the slow, brutal work of changing a system that had been designed to benefit men at women's expense. Elizabeth listened with her heart in her throat. This was her story, told in legal terminology and case precedents. This was what she'd fled from, what hundreds of other women were still trapped in, what Charlotte Green was trying to dismantle one case at a time. After the meeting, Elizabeth approached the lawyer. "Miss Green, I'd like to help with your work. I don't have money to donate, but I have time, and I have experience with the kind of contracts you described." Charlotte studied her with intelligent gray eyes.
"What kind of experience?" "The kind I'd rather not discuss in public." "Come to my office tomorrow, 2 o'clock. We'll talk." She handed Elizabeth a card with an address downtown. "I'm always looking for women brave enough to testify, to add their voices to the fight. Maybe you're one of them." Elizabeth went to the office the next day, her hands shaking as she climbed the stairs to Charlotte's practice. The lawyer's office was small but organized, walls lined with law books and case files. Charlotte sat behind a desk piled with papers, and when Elizabeth entered, she gestured to a chair. "Sit. Tell me your story." So Elizabeth did. She told Charlotte about her father's death, about the debt contract, about being sold to Victor Hale like livestock. She described the ranch, Margaret's death, the wedding she'd fled, the storm that had covered her tracks. She left out names and places, protecting the people who'd helped her, but she told the substance of it, the coercion, the legal trap, the impossible choice between starvation and servitude. Charlotte listened without interrupting, taking occasional notes. When Elizabeth finished, the lawyer sat back, her expression grim. "Your case is exactly the kind I've been building toward. A debt contract that amounts to involuntary servitude. A marriage entered under duress. A woman with the courage to escape." She tapped her pen against her desk. "Here's the problem. To challenge the contract in court, you'd have to come forward publicly. Use your real name. Face the man you ran from. He'd countersue for breach of contract. It would be ugly, expensive, and highly public." "I can't do that." Elizabeth's voice was steady. "He's too powerful. He'd destroy me." "Probably. Which is why most women don't fight." Charlotte leaned forward. "But there's another way."
I'm working on a case right now, similar to yours, but the woman involved has money and family willing to back her. If we win, it sets precedent. It creates legal ground for other women to stand on. Your story, your testimony about what these contracts really are, that could strengthen our case. But you could testify anonymously. No real names, just the facts of what happened to you. Anonymous testimony, is that even allowed? It's unusual, but my client's lawyer and I have been arguing that these cases involve women fleeing dangerous situations. Forcing them to testify publicly puts them at risk. Some judges are sympathetic. Charlotte's expression was cautious hope. I can't promise anything, but if you're willing to try, you might help change the system that trapped you. Elizabeth thought about Margaret, about the other women Hale might purchase if no one stopped him, about every woman trapped in similar contracts across the frontier, with no escape and no hope. I'll do it, she said. Tell me what you need. The case moved slowly through the courts over the next 6 months. Charlotte prepared Elizabeth's testimony carefully, stripping away identifying details while preserving the core truths. They practiced until Elizabeth could tell her story without crying, without rage, presenting it as simple fact rather than trauma. The day of the hearing arrived in January, almost exactly a year after Eliza Whitmore had boarded the train in Chicago that started everything. Elizabeth sat in the gallery of a San Francisco courthouse, watching Charlotte and another lawyer argue before a judge about whether debt contracts that compelled marriage constituted involuntary servitude. The opposing lawyer argued tradition, necessity, the sanctity of contracts freely entered. Charlotte argued coercion, duress, the fundamental human right to refuse marriage regardless of financial circumstances. Back and forth they went, citing precedents and statutes, fighting over whether a woman's body and future could be collateral for her father's debts. When Elizabeth was called to testify, she walked to the witness stand on legs that threatened to buckle. She wore her best dress, still shabby, but clean and mended with care. She kept her eyes on Charlotte, not looking at the judge or the opposing lawyer or the people in the gallery. Charlotte walked her through the questions they'd practiced. How old was she when the contract was presented? What alternatives were offered? What happened when she arrived at her intended husband's ranch? What convinced her that fleeing was necessary? Elizabeth answered each question clearly, her voice steady. She didn't mention Hale by name or specify Silver Ridge. She talked about a powerful rancher and a remote ranch, and a man whose first wife had died under suspicious circumstances. She described the contract's terms, the debt, the marriage requirement, the lack of any escape clause. She explained the choice she'd faced, starvation or servitude. The opposing lawyer tried to rattle her during cross-examination. You signed the contract willingly, did you not? I signed it because the alternative was death. That's not willing, that's coercion. The contract specified marriage. You knew the terms. I knew the words. I didn't understand what they meant in practice until I arrived and learned what happened to the previous woman who'd accepted those terms. So you defaulted on a legal agreement because you changed your mind? Elizabeth met his eyes. I fled because staying meant dying slowly, just like the woman before me. I chose life over legal compliance. I'd make the same choice again. The exchange continued, but Elizabeth held her ground. She'd survived Victor Hale's ranch, a winter storm in the mountains, and a year of hiding in a strange city. One hostile lawyer couldn't shake her now. When she was finally dismissed, Elizabeth returned to the gallery and watched the rest of the proceedings. The judge asked questions, clearly troubled by the case's implications. If he ruled that debt, contracts compelling marriage were invalid, it would overturn dozens of similar arrangements across the territories. Men would lose their purchased brides. Women would lose the financial security, such as it was, those contracts provided. But if he upheld the contracts, he'd be endorsing a system that treated women as transferable property, bought and sold to settle debts they hadn't incurred. The judge took the case under advisement, promising a ruling within 30 days. Elizabeth left the courthouse exhausted but strangely hopeful. She'd told her story. She'd fought back, even anonymously. Whatever happened next, she'd stood up and said this system is wrong, and I won't accept it. The 30 days felt eternal. Elizabeth worked at the factory, lived her life, tried not to obsess over the ruling. But every evening, she checked the newspapers for news from the courts, hoping for word that might change everything. The ruling came on a Thursday morning. Elizabeth was at work when Mary ran up, waving a newspaper. Elizabeth, look at this. That case Charlotte was working on. The judge ruled in her favor. Elizabeth grabbed the paper, reading frantically. The judge had declared that marriage contracts entered under financial duress constituted a form of involuntary servitude and were therefore unenforceable. Women who'd signed such contracts under coercion could petition to have them voided. The ruling was limited to California initially, but Charlotte told the reporter it would be used as precedent in cases across the Western territories. Elizabeth's hands shook as she read her own story reflected in the judge's decision. He'd cited the anonymous testimony of a young woman whose case exemplified the coercive nature of these arrangements. He'd written that no civilized society should permit the sale of human beings under any guise, including marriage contracts. "You all right?" Mary asked, concerned by Elizabeth's tears. "I thought this would make you happy." "It does. These are happy tears." Elizabeth wiped her eyes, laughing. "This is the best news I've heard in a long time." What she couldn't tell Mary was that this ruling meant her escape had been vindicated. The contract she'd broken was now legally recognized as invalid. If Hale somehow found her, he'd have no legal ground to stand on. She was free, not just practically, but legally. That evening, Elizabeth returned to Charlotte's office with a bottle of wine and a heart full of gratitude. The lawyer was celebrating with her colleagues, and they welcomed Elizabeth into their circle. "You helped make this happen," Charlotte said, raising her glass. "Your testimony gave the judge a human face to put to abstract legal principles. Without you, he might have ruled differently." "What happens now?" Elizabeth asked. "Now we file petitions on behalf of every woman we can find who's trapped in one of these contracts. We use this ruling as a wedge to open up other challenges, and we keep fighting until every state recognizes that women aren't property." Charlotte's smile was fierce. "It's going to take years, maybe decades, but we've won the first battle." Elizabeth stayed at the celebration for an hour, then walked home through streets that felt different somehow. Still crowded, still chaotic, but now charged with possibility. She'd been part of changing the law. Her story, her escape, her refusal to accept what everyone said was inevitable. It had mattered. The next day she wrote a letter. Not to Mrs. Davison this time, but to Mrs. Shaw. She kept it brief, used her new name, included no return address. But she wanted the housekeeper to know that her help hadn't been wasted, that the woman she'd aided in escaping had survived and was fighting to make sure other women could do the same. She didn't know if the letter would reach Mrs. Shaw, or if Hale would intercept it, or if the housekeeper was even still at the ranch. But she sent it anyway, a message in a bottle tossed into the vastness of distance and time. Spring came again, and with it, change. The factory where Elizabeth worked closed suddenly, the owner fleeing ahead of his creditors. Elizabeth found herself unemployed along with 24 other women, all competing for limited positions in the remaining textile operations. But Charlotte Green had an offer. "I need someone to manage the office, coordinate with clients, handle correspondence. The pay's not great, but it's steady, and you'd be working towards something important." Elizabeth accepted immediately. The legal work was fascinating, learning about cases, helping women navigate the system that had been designed to work against them, seeing firsthand how laws changed when people refused to accept injustice. She learned to type, to take dictation, to organize case files. Charlotte taught her legal terminology, let her read briefs and rulings, explain strategies and precedents. Elizabeth absorbed it all with the hunger of someone who'd been denied education but possessed natural aptitude. A year passed, then 2. Elizabeth moved to a better apartment, saved more money, helped Charlotte win case after case. The marriage contract precedent spread to other states, other territories. Women across the West petitioned to void contracts that had trapped them. Some succeeded, some didn't. But the fight continued, and Elizabeth was part of it. She never saw Victor Hale again, though she sometimes wondered what had happened to him. Had he found another woman to purchase? Had the legal changes affected his ability to buy brides? Did he ever think about the woman who'd fled his ranch the night before their wedding, or had she been just another failed transaction in his ledger? It didn't matter. He belonged to her past, and her past was something she'd escaped. 5 years after fleeing Montana Territory, Elizabeth stood in Charlotte's office reviewing files for their newest case, a woman from Wyoming whose husband had purchased her through a debt contract and was now suing for her return after she'd escaped to California. "We'll win this one," Charlotte said confidently.
The precedent's too strong. She'll be free within 6 months. Another woman saved. Elizabeth smiled. How many does that make? 73 cases won, maybe 24 more in progress. Charlotte stretched, tired but satisfied. We're making a difference, Elizabeth. Slowly, but we're making it. That evening, Elizabeth walked home through streets she'd learned to navigate with confidence. She stopped at the bakery below her apartment and bought bread. Real bread, not the cheap kind she'd once subsisted on, but good sourdough that cost an extra nickel. She could afford the luxury now. In her apartment, she made tea and sat by the window watching the city move below. Somewhere out there were women still trapped in contracts they couldn't escape, marriages they hadn't chosen, lives determined by other people's decisions, but fewer than before. And every day, that number decreased. She thought about Eliza Whitmore, that frightened girl on a train heading west to marry a stranger. That girl didn't exist anymore. She'd been transformed by choice and necessity into Elizabeth Crane, a woman who'd learned that surviving wasn't enough, that freedom required constant defense, that changing an unjust system was work that never ended but mattered more than anything. 10 years after the escape, Elizabeth married. Not because she needed financial security or because a contract compelled her, but because she'd met a man who treated her as an equal. James was a journalist who'd covered the marriage contract cases, and he'd been impressed by Charlotte's legal work and by the woman who managed her office with quiet competence. They courted slowly, carefully, because Elizabeth needed to trust that this choice was truly hers. James understood, never pushed, made it clear that her autonomy mattered more than his desire for partnership. When he finally proposed, Elizabeth said yes, not out of desperation or duty, but because she wanted to build a life with this man who respected her choices. The wedding was small, held in Charlotte's office with Mary and a few other friends as witnesses. No expensive dress, no elaborate ceremony, no performance of ownership disguised as romance. Just two people making a commitment to support each other's growth and freedom. Elizabeth kept her name, Elizabeth Crane, the identity she'd built from nothing. James didn't object. He understood that names carried power, that the woman he was marrying had created herself deliberately and wasn't about to surrender that creation. They bought a small house near the waterfront. Elizabeth continued working with Charlotte, though she'd taken on more complex responsibilities, appearing in court, filing briefs, even arguing some cases herself without formal legal training. California's progressive judges sometimes allowed it, recognizing that lived experience counted for something. Children came eventually, 2 daughters born 3 years apart. Elizabeth raised them with fierce intentionality, teaching them that their bodies belonged to themselves, that marriage was a choice, not an obligation, that financial dependence on men was dangerous. She told them edited versions of her history, about fleeing an untenable situation, about building a new life through courage and work, about fighting to change laws that treated women as property. She never told them about Victor Hale specifically, about the ranch or the wedding dress or the storm. Some details were too painful to share, too likely to be misunderstood. But she made sure they understood the core truth. Women's freedom required constant vigilance and active defense. Charlotte's practice grew into a full firm dedicated to women's rights. Elizabeth became a partner, though she lacked formal legal credentials. Her name appeared on the letterhead. Green and Crane, attorneys at law. She argued cases before judges who'd once dismissed women's testimony as emotional and unreliable. She won more often than she lost. 20 years after fleeing Montana Territory, Elizabeth received a letter. The return address was Silver Ridge, Montana, but the sender wasn't Victor Hale. It was from a lawyer handling Hale's estate. Elizabeth's hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a brief note explaining that Victor Hale had died, a heart attack, sudden, at age 72. The estate was being settled. During the process, they'd found a contract with her name on it, Eliza Whitmore's name, and wanted to confirm she had no claims against the estate. She wrote back immediately, saying she had no claims and requesting confirmation that the contract was void per California precedent. The lawyer responded within 2 weeks, confirming the contract had been nullified and no further action was required. Victor Hale was dead. The man who tried to own her had died while she'd built a life, a career, a family. He'd ended alone. The estate papers mentioned no wife, no children, just property to be divided among distant relatives.
Elizabeth felt nothing about his death. No satisfaction, no grief, no sense of justice served. He was simply irrelevant to the person she'd become. His attempt to control her life had failed so completely that his death barely registered as significant. She filed the letters away and returned to work on a case involving a 16-year-old girl whose father had signed a contract selling her to a 50-year-old rancher. Elizabeth would win that case, just as she'd won dozens before it, just as she'd keep winning until no father could sell his daughter and no rancher could buy a bride. The years continued their march. Elizabeth's daughters grew into strong, independent women. One became a doctor, the other a professor. Careers that would have been impossible a generation earlier, made possible by the work Elizabeth and women like her had done to expand opportunities. Charlotte retired and Elizabeth took over the firm. She hired young women lawyers fresh from university, trained them in the strategies she'd learned, passed on the torch of advocacy and activism. The fight for women's rights continued, evolving into new battles over voting rights, property ownership, reproductive autonomy. Elizabeth engaged with all of it, her early trauma transformed into lifelong purpose. At 60, Elizabeth stood in a courtroom arguing her final case before retirement. The details were different, but the core was familiar. A woman trapped by legal mechanisms designed to limit her freedom, fighting to break free. Elizabeth presented the precedents, cited the cases she'd won over decades, appealed to the judge's sense of justice and fairness. She won. Walking out of the courthouse that day, Elizabeth felt the weight of accumulated years and victories. She'd lived a full life, richer and longer than Eliza Whitmore could have imagined while signing that contract in Chicago. She'd loved and been loved. She'd raised children who were free in ways she'd had to fight to become. She'd changed laws that had seemed immutable. At 75, Elizabeth sat in the garden behind the house she'd shared with James for decades. He'd passed 3 years earlier, and she missed him daily, but she'd learned long ago that loss was part of living fully. Her daughters visited often, brought grandchildren who listened to her stories about the old days when women couldn't vote and marriage could be compelled. One of her granddaughters, studying history at university, asked her once, "Grandmother, do you think you would have been happier if you'd just stayed in Montana? If you'd married that man and accepted what everyone said was inevitable?" Elizabeth considered the question seriously. Happier? Maybe for brief moments. There's a certain peace in accepting what you can't change, but I wouldn't have been alive. Not really. I would have been a ghost inhabiting a life someone else designed. She looked at her granddaughter. Real happiness requires real freedom, and real freedom requires being willing to risk everything to claim it. The granddaughter nodded, understanding in her young eyes that this wasn't ancient history, but a living truth that every generation had to relearn. Elizabeth died at 81, peacefully, in the same house she'd bought with money she'd earned through work she'd chosen. Her obituary in the San Francisco Chronicle mentioned her decades of legal advocacy, the hundreds of cases she'd won, the precedents she'd set that continued to protect women's rights. It didn't mention Victor Hale or the ranch or the wedding that never happened. Those details had faded into irrelevance, footnotes to a life that had been defined by what she'd built rather than what she'd fled. At her funeral, Charlotte Greene's daughter, now leading the firm that bore both their mothers' names, told the gathering that Elizabeth had once been a woman with nothing who'd transformed herself into a force that changed history. "She taught us that freedom isn't given," the younger Greene said. "It's taken, defended, and expanded. She taught us that one woman's courage to say no can echo through generations. She taught us that we're not property, not contracts, not anyone's to own. We're ourselves, fully and completely, and that's worth fighting for." Mary O'Brien, elderly now, and leaning on a cane, added her own memory. "Elizabeth used to tell me she'd made a choice between two terrible options and picked the one that let her stay herself. But that's not quite right. She didn't just stay herself. She became herself, deliberately, courageously, over decades of hard work. That's the real legacy." Elizabeth's daughters scattered her ashes in San Francisco Bay, watching them dissolve into water that flowed to the ocean and from there to everywhere. It seemed fitting for a woman who'd traveled so far, who'd transformed herself so completely, who'd refused to let anyone else determine the shape or direction of her life. The precedents she'd set remained in law books, cited in cases for decades after her death. The firm she'd built continued its work. The women she'd helped freed went on to build their own lives, raise their own daughters. Pass on the understanding that freedom was both birthright and constant battle. And somewhere in Montana, in a cemetery near a ranch that had long since been divided and sold, Margaret Hale's grave stood with its simple marker. No one remembered her anymore except as a footnote in legal cases, the first wife whose death had warned the second wife to run. But Eliza Whitmore, who'd become Elizabeth Crane, who'd become herself against all odds, she was remembered. Not in monuments or statues, but in the quiet confidence of women who knew they owned themselves, who chose their own paths, who understood that no contract could buy what they refused to sell. That was the victory. Not defeating Victor Hale specifically, but defeating the entire system that had enabled men like him. Not just escaping one cage, but helping dismantle the mechanisms that built cages around women's lives. The train that had carried Eliza West all those years ago continued running, carrying other people toward other futures. But none of those futures included women being transported as property to ranches where they'd be bought and bred and buried. That world had ended, dismantled piece by women who refused to accept that their lives belonged to anyone but themselves. And if you could have asked Elizabeth, in that final moment before she died, whether fleeing into that winter storm had been worth it, worth the terror and the cold and the decades of looking over her shoulder, she would have answered without hesitation. Yes. 1,000 times yes. Because she'd lived as herself, died as herself, and left behind a world slightly better than the one she'd found. That was enough. That was everything. The story that had started with a girl being sold ended with a woman who'd bought back not just herself, but countless others. And in the end, that transaction, freedom for freedom, courage for courage, one woman's choice multiplying across generations, balanced every ledger that had ever tried to price a human life.